All right. Good evening to everyone. Let's go ahead and get started our meeting. Welcome to the Monday, March 6, 2023 meeting of the Falls Church City Council. Tonight is a work session. That means the discussion is here at the dais with City Council. There will be opportunities for you to speak at other meetings, just not at this one. I know many of you are here for the T-zone discussion, which will be second on our agenda, so we will have another matter before that. You're welcome to come and go as you please, but let's go ahead and get started. First, we have a motion regarding electronic participation. Would someone like to make that regarding Phil Duncan?
I can, Mayor.
Yes, please.
I move that the City Council approve electronic participation by Phil Duncan in this meeting for medical reasons pursuant to the City Council's policy for remote participation in City Council meetings as adopted by Resolution 2023-01. Mr. Duncan, can you state the reasons for participating by electronic means?
I'm a patient at Fairfax and I know the hospital and the Falls Church, the Fairfax County portion of Falls Church.
All right, the other Falls Church. Okay.
The other.
Welcome. We wish you the best of luck, of course. Do we have a second on the motion?
Second.
So let's say Mr. Snyder on the second. All in favor? Do we do this by roll call? Let's go ahead and do it by roll call. All right.
Ms. Connolly?
Yes.
Mr. Duncan? Abstain.
Yes.
Ms. Hardy?
Yes.
Ms. Leon?
Yes.
Ms. Hiscott?
Yes.
Ms. Mayor Tarter?
Yes.
Thank you, Council. That passes. And Mayor, I can use that also for roll call if you wish.
Okay, that's fine. All right. So let's go ahead and move on to the first item on our work session, which is a solid waste management plan overview and timeline. Mr. Shields?
Thank you, Mayor Tarter and members of council. I'll turn this right over to Ms. Marchetti, who is the city solid waste coordinator, and she is the staff liaison to the solid waste task force, which the council has appointed to update the city's solid waste plan. Ms. Marchetti, if you'd like to take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Shields. Good evening, Mr. Mayor. Good evening, council members. Tonight, we are here to provide a brief overview of our state-mandated 20-year solid waste management plan and to share our tentative timeline to completion. This timeline is tentative as the SWMPAC has not yet approved it. Also on this call are our consultants, Eugenia and Chris with, Gresham, Brinkner, and Bratton, GBB, to provide their findings with us thus far. A little bit of background, our last plan was submitted to DEQ back in 2004, and since the SWIP only covers a 20-year plan, it is now time for us to prepare a new plan. This is a perfect opportunity for the city to assess and progress towards meeting state and local mandates, reducing waste stream, increasing recycling and other solid waste objectives, and to set new goals for the future. As state regulated, the SWIP will provide an integrated solid waste management plan, and a long-range planning for all solid waste needs over the next 20 years. The SWIP will be a strategic plan to serve as a guide, providing general direction instead of hard commitments. Implementation of the approved SWIP will likely change over time based on staff time and budget. In the spring of 2022, City Council approved an ad hoc 5-person member SWMPAC. Of the 5 positions, 3 have been filled, and we currently have 1 application to fill 1 of the vacancies. To date, the SWMPAC has only met once. We have our second meeting this week on Wednesday. Which is open to the public. And thus far, we have essentially kind of done a little bit of housekeeping, elected a chair, elected a vice chair, and voted on a few things. Again, our timeline is tentative. We are currently in task 2. So GBB, who is also on the call, so they are still essentially reviewing historical data. They've met with us, the SWIMPAC group, and they are providing projections. And then our task 3 will just be data gathering via SurveyMonkey to the public. And then task 4 will essentially be internal review, and as council dictates, whichever boards and commissions they want us to have review the draft, and then it will go back out to public comment to review the draft, and then we will essentially submit it to City Council for adoption. At this point, I will hand it over to GBB. On this call, we have Chris and Eugenia. If you wanted to take over.
We sure can. Thank you. And Eugenia, are you running the slides?
No.
Okay. All right. Then I'll just I'll make a notification of advancing them. Okay. Good evening. My name is Chris Lund, and I'm with GBB, and it's a pleasure to be here. We are here to present an overview of the planning effort for solid waste management that the city has embarked upon. And thank you in advance for this opportunity to be a partner with the city community in supporting you all in this endeavor. Next slide. Just quickly, GBB's just a small experienced solid waste management firm with our offices here in Northern Virginia. Over the last 40 years, we're actually in Vienna. We provide comprehensive solid waste strategic planning for communities like you. Representing and presenting for GBB today, I'd like to introduce you to Eugenia Manuelian, your GBB project manager, who will be taking you through the presentation tonight. Eugenia?
Thank you.
Next slide.
So today we'll just go over some basics of the solid waste management plan, a few details about your waste flow, your population forecast, your waste generation rate, and we'll focus on the timeline. And as was mentioned, we're sort of at the beginning of this process and at the beginning of working with the task force. Next slide. Oof. So a solid waste management plan. Yeah. A solid waste management plan sets forth goals and a strategy to develop, strengthen, and maintain environmentally, economically, and socially sound management systems for all solid waste generated in the city. It is mandated by the state. It requires all designated regions, cities, counties, and towns to develop this comprehensive and integrated solid waste management plan that at minimum considers and addresses all components of the waste hierarchy: source reduction, reuse, recycling, resource recovery, incineration, and landfilling. It is a really important process. It is state mandated. It is an opportunity to create alignment with other city plans and goals. Next slide. And here are some elements that are included in the plan. There is understanding the waste flow. So what is generated, what are the different categories, where it is going, and what are the levers of change and impact. Next slide. The plan is the projections are, we begin our projections with your population forecast. We create your projections, your waste projections based on your population. And then we model different scenarios, taking different kind of development strategies that the city may be considering into account. Next slide. We look at your municipal solid waste generation rate, which, not including recycling, is currently about 2 pounds per person per day. Next slide. We consider your municipal solid waste and recycling generation rate, which currently, based on our analysis so far, is about 4.5 pounds per person per day, which is close to the EPA national average of 4.9 pounds per person per day. Next slide. Well, here we can kind of hone in a little bit. And Lonnie mentioned this already, so I don't want to be too kind of redundant, but you can see where we are in March. That yellow diamond is this deliverable, is just this presentation. We are still in the system analysis, making our projections. We're starting to work with the task force to establish the SWAMP goals, and from the goals, we generate our recommendations. Then we move into the public outreach and input. We develop the survey, we deploy it, we analyze the results, and then we move into preparing and delivering the solid waste management plan. We deliver a draft. There is a review period for the task force. Then we deliver a draft for city review. Then there is public hearing and public comment period. Then that input is then incorporated into the report. And then finally, it is submitted to the state by June of 2024. Next slide. I think that's pretty much it. We wanted to leave a little time to see if anyone had any questions.
All right. Let's see if anyone has any questions. Mr. Shields, do you have anything to add or any color or flavor to add to that presentation?
Well, one, I want to thank Ms. Marchetti and our team that will work with our task force to update this plan. In terms of context, I would just say that this plan in the past has really been an important document for us. As you noted, we do have a high recycling rate in the city of Falls Church that came about through this type of a planning effort, actually starting back in the 80s when the city was a leader in the area of standing up recycling capacity and staff working with community, with the block captains and the education process that really transformed how we treat solid waste in the city. That's an example of how this planning process produced real results for the community and for the environment. So we're looking forward to updating the plan, setting new goals with community, and it is a challenging time. We've talked a lot about glass recycling or finding, working with the region to find markets for our recyclables. That is a challenge for us. That's why our recycling rate has dropped in recent years. That's a trend that we would like to reverse. And working with community, staff, and consultants, hopefully we can make some progress in these areas. A lot of these will need some regional solutions as well, so we need to probably take the conversation from this room out with our peers to try to change the way the region treats recycling as well, given some of the trends that we're facing. That's a little bit of context, and look forward to working with you, and hope if you have any more questions or discussions tonight, hopefully we can respond to those.
All right, well, let's start with Mr. Duncan, who I believe has his hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Sorry if I missed this. Does this solid waste plan include solid waste generated by multifamily buildings? I know we've had some discussions in the past from some of the multifamily buildings about how their solid waste is handled and charged for and so forth. Without litigating the specifics of that, is this a group that is going to entertain some of those communications that we've heard from in the past?
Sure. The plan, Lonnie, jump in. The plan will address all the waste generated in the city, and then the task force will develop strategies of will understand how it's currently being addressed, and will consider improvements to addressing it. So yes.
Okay, great, thanks.
Ms. Hardy?
Thank you. I look forward to the recommendations. Two suggestions for scope. One is there was a really compelling Atlantic article from 2022 that talked about how essentially plastic recycling hasn't worked. We essentially ship a bunch of it off to China and count it as recycled. And so I think that's really important to kind of keep in mind. I think the leading thinking on solid waste these days is instead of just increasing recycling and reusing, which obviously we've done a good job in the city in the past, is actually reducing. And so I'd like to see a lot more emphasis on reduction part of the R's. I remember when my kids went through Operation Earthwatch, it was the 3 R's, and I think the reduction piece needs a lot more emphasis. So that's the first thing I would suggest for scope. The second is we have a pretty successful and award-winning composting program. And so I would love to see that residential composting program thought put towards expanding it to our businesses as well as our mixed-use communities. How do we make that program accessible, especially given that half our population is now inside multifamily buildings? I think that's a really big opportunity. And we've got some businesses, I think, who are very pro recycling and composting, so it would be great to get them on board. But overall, look forward to the recommendations. Thank you.
All right, other questions or comments? Some down the other end. Let's go with Ms. Leon, then Ms. Conley.
Yes, thank you for this presentation. I just, I'm curious around expectations. When we take a look at these recommendations, are you going to provide more breakdown by type of recycling that's generated? Will you include, you know, any, like what percentage of that is hazardous waste? Like, are you going to provide that breakdown at a little bit more detailed level than that graph that you showed on page, what was it, 4?
Yeah. Yes, it's it's quite a detailed report, and you can always take a look at the current solid waste management plan to get a sense of the level of detail.
For what would come out of this exercise. Okay.
Mhm.
So on that work plan, is it coming back to council? Like I support the phases, public outreach is important, but I'd love to be able to see some of that at a work session in council, even before it goes out for public input. What's planned in terms of what comes back to council to keep us in the loop along the way? Or maybe Mr. Shields, that's a question for you.
Ms. Marchetti, would you like to respond to that first?
I would. We will most definitely be back at a work session to essentially maybe about our midpoint. I mean, like I said, we've only had one meeting thus far, so we just wanted to share essentially what it is and our timeline. But we will definitely be back as often as you would like.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Conley?
Thank you for that presentation. I'm really looking forward to the public education piece of this, because it does seem, in my years of being aware of the 3 Rs, that things change all the time. So when, you know, several years ago, we all recycled our glass, and now we don't recycle it in the same way. Currently, the high school's doing a plastic film recycling project, which isn't something that can go in our recycling bin. So I'm very interested to find out, like, what's the current state of what can be recycled, what can we do with it, and how can we, as a community, pull together to, as Mr. Shields said, get ourselves to the highest rates of recycling that we used to have in the past. Thanks very much.
All right, Mr. Snyder?
My comment would be only that we have full participation by all elements of the community, including multifamily housing and commercial single-family housing institutions. So we work together to reduce the stream of waste in the first place, and we do it in a way that provides incentives, not mandates. Thank you.
All right. Well, my question does go to mandates. Let me ask this, either of the city attorney or our consultants. Can we require, for example, multifamily or restaurants or other places to do certain measures, you know, whether it's composting or whether it's recycling? What are the limits kind of this? Do you all know? In other words, is everything voluntary sort of throughout the city, or is there anything that we can do as a city to require certain things? Where do the limits fall on this? Anyone's welcome to answer if you happen to know the answer.
Chris, do you want to jump in on that one? I mean, there are absolutely policies and material bans that you can implement. Chris, do you want to add anything to that? General?
No, that's true. I think that he was looking for some specifics that are currently happening in the community that the local community may be more aware of as we get more familiar with those types of incentives or mandates.
So, I mean, I guess my question is really like to, for example, a restaurant. Can we as a city say you have to recycle, you know, or was it like everything voluntary? Maybe the city attorney could weigh in if you happen to know.
I'm happy to weigh in. But my answer is going to be at this point that it's an interesting question. We'd have to look at that. I mean, everything that we've seen in the past has to do mostly with voluntary recycling and voluntary programs. But if it's the will of the council, we'll certainly add that to the work, to the tasking of what we should be looking at in this context.
Okay. I mean, to me, it's just so, I mean, voluntary is great, but there are multifamily buildings that have, 700 people in them. It'd be great if sort of the building took the leadership of that, and maybe not just, at their will or discretion, but that as a matter of policy, all commercial buildings or all multifamily residential buildings certainly have to have certain things in place. I think it would very much increase levels of recycling and the like, but I'm curious as whether we actually have the authority to do that. So something I'd certainly not be extensive task, but if it's something that can be found out fairly easily, I'd be interested in the answer to that. Okay, well, listen, unless there's any other questions, why don't we thank you all very much for coming out this evening, remotely or virtually, and appreciate your work and look forward to further feedback.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks so much. All right, let's move on to T-zones, transitional zones. Mr. Shields?
I'll just make a few introductory comments. Joining us for this work session discussion is our Director of Planning, Paul Stoddard. We have our lead planner for this zoning text amendment, Jack Trainer, sitting here to my right. And we also have the city attorney, Mr. Brian Lupkeman, who is on this call to answer questions that the council might have. Since the council referred this to the Planning Commission back in May of 2022, the Planning Commission held a series of work sessions and public hearings on this proposed zoning text amendment. What we will do tonight is discuss the Planning Commission's recommendations. In your staff report is a chart that lays side by side in certain policy areas of concern what the current zoning states, what the council's referral back in May proposed, and what the Planning Commission's recommendations and how they are, in areas where they're the same as what the council referral was and areas where they are different. So hopefully that chart will help clarify some of the issues and set up a good discussion for tonight. What our plan is to hold a town hall meeting on the week of March 20th, and we'll get publicity out that, but we really want to have a discussion with the City Council in terms of what you're expecting to see. I'm sorry, March 21st. I saw some questioning eyes. The week of March 20th, we're looking for Tuesday, March 21st as the date for that town hall meeting. But also just have a general discussion with the City Council on schedule and what your expectations are on schedule and public engagement going forward so staff can build that process accordingly. We are, on our schedule is to come back to the City Council at a work session between now and April 24th to discuss actual code language that would reflect the discussion of tonight and then carry that forward to a regular session on April 24th for first reading. But that, of course, is contingent upon how the direction tonight. And so let me turn it over to Mr. Stoddard just for his introductory comments, and then I think Mr. Trainer will walk us through the chart itself so we can get acquainted with the policy questions and how they are, in terms of current zoning, the council's referral, and the Planning Commission's recommendations. Mr. Stoddard.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Shields. Thank you, Mayor Tarter and members of council. As Wyatt said, I am Paul Stoddard, the planning director with the city. Happy to be in front of you again with the latest T-zone materials. Actually, if we are able to put the staff report up on the team screen, I think that would be helpful. But as Wyatt said, this is a work session to present to council the Planning Commission's recommendations as well as recommendations from other boards and commissions, and to get direction from council so that staff can properly prepare for that public town hall. As Wyatt said, the week of March 20th and most likely Tuesday, March 21st. I'm actually going to skip over the recommendation so that Mr. Trainer can walk through that in more detail. And I'm going to jump down to project history. It's line 22 of the staff report. It's actually at the top of page 5. Oh, there it is. This has been a journey to get to this point. Of course, this started back in February of 2021. At the time, the council was taking final action on changes to the special exception criteria. That's the zoning process where the larger mixed-use buildings were entitled and approved. And council provided direction to staff to come back with a zoning mechanism that could entitle a smaller project, more of an infill style project, and one that could potentially be all residential. Jumping to line 30, after reviewing the zoning on the books, staff recommended T-zones as the best candidate zoning district to amend to suit those needs. First, because of its design function, the T-zones are intended to sit between the B districts and the R districts and provide that design transition. And also because in comparison to the level of investment seen in the B zones and the R zones, the T zones had been more stagnant than others, in large part because the rules in the existing T zones don't sort of fit the mix that trying to get into a B zone in an SE process leads itself to too big of a project, whereas staying in the T zones as they're written today is largely too small of a project. And so those buildings are largely will stay steady in their current state. There were, of course, several work sessions with staff and council to work out the specifics, beginning there on line 36, before council provided a first reading to refer out proposed changes to the T zones. And as I mentioned earlier, then several work sessions with the Planning Commission, as well as advice from other boards and commissions, led to the Planning Commission's recommendations in February. I'm just going to step through a couple of paragraphs in this need for housing section. On line 43, of course, the idea of planning for housing is central to the discipline of city planning, and specifically providing for an adequate supply of housing to meet projected population growth, as well as household makeup. And providing for that housing supply is one of the linchpins of sustainable planning, and meeting all three legs of that sustainability stool, of course, social, economic, as well as environmental. And this is done with an eye of meeting the needs of both current as well as future generations. And those tenets of planning are carried into the city's comprehensive plan, where the vision statement states that the city preserves small town character and history while honoring a deep commitment to progress in a growing community. Looking at population projections on line 50, the latest projections from the city were done pre-COVID in 2019. And I apologize, there is a typo here. That should read 59 households in 2025, but 53 or 5,900 households in 2020 or 25, up to 9,300 households in 2045. Post-COVID for demographic projections, the first ones we have available are at the regional level, and those continue to project a notable increase in population, and along with it, an increase in housing demand, going from about 5.7 million people to 7 million people between 2020 and 2045, and a growth in household demand from 2.1 million households to 2.7 million households. And I'm actually going to leave it there on the need for housing. There's obviously a lot more information in the report, but I don't want to step through all of that in detail. At this point, I'll turn it over to our case planner on this one, Mr. Jack Trainer.
Thank you, Mr. Stoddard. And good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of council. My name is Jack Trainer, and I'm the case planner for the T-zones. And as Mr. Shields mentioned earlier, we have this chart here comparing what's currently allowed in the T-zones, what council referred out in May 22, and the Planning Commission's recommendation, which they made this past February. So we've grouped all the considerations into a handful of similar clusters. I think there's about 7 of them, so I'll just walk through them quickly. The first here, so starting on line 18, residential and commercial uses for 1 to 4 family buildings. In current zoning, only single family and duplexes are allowed by right. In the council referral that had removing single family and 2 family uses as allowable uses. And in the Planning Commission recommendation, that included a grandfather clause for all existing single-family and 2-family homes, but also allowing triplexes and quadplexes by right. For townhouses are also allowed by right today, but we also note that townhouses are regulated through the RTH district, which requires 3-acre minimum lot sizes, and so it makes it very difficult to build if impossible. In the council recommendation, all residential uses, including townhouses, condos, and apartments, would be allowed conditionally through the special use permit process on sites of 1 acre or less. And Planning Commission held the same as the council when it came to townhouses. For mixed use, today mixed use redevelopment is allowed as regulated through the MUR regulation. Council had removing the MUR, and the Planning Commission held the same. For commercial uses, there's a series of by right uses allowed today. Council in its referral had removing boarding houses, lodging, and rooming houses, and adding a series of retail use, service, and goods type uses. The Planning Commission was largely the same. They included in its recommendation removing parking lots as a principal use, and also recommended re-examining the list of what could be by right commercial uses in the T-zones. I think there was just one more note on that. I think there's a little, there's a question about, for instance, why some uses made the list and why other retail uses weren't. So I think they're looking for a little clarification on that list. Now for building height and setbacks. For building height, today 1 and 2 family structures can be built 2.5 stories tall or 35 feet, whichever is the shortest. And for townhouses, that's 3 stories, 35 feet, and all other uses is 3 stories or 45 feet. In the council's referral, all uses could be built to 4 stories or 50 feet. In the Planning Commission's recommendation, 3 and 4 family homes could be built to 2.5 stories or 35 feet tall. By right commercial could be built to 3 stories or 40 feet, and any conditional residential or commercial uses could be built to 4 stories or 50 feet, mirroring what council referred out. For the step backs, there was no step back language, there's no step back requirements in the T-zones today. In council's referral, that included a 10-foot step back for buildings facing residential districts specifically. In the Planning Commission's recommendation, that included the 10-foot step back when facing residential districts, but also expanded it to include all street frontages for buildings taller than 40 feet. Next, I'll address setbacks. Starting with the front yard, for 1 and 2 family buildings, that's 25 feet. For townhouses, it's also 25 feet. And all other uses is 15 feet, except those that front Broad or Washington, where the requirement is a 20-foot front setback. In the council referral, all front yards would be 15 feet. Setback requirements, except, again, those on Broad and Washington. In the Planning Commission's recommendation, they upped that to 20 feet with a conditional reduction of up to a 15 feet front yard setback through the special use permit. And in the rear, for 1 and 2 family, this is 30 feet. Townhouses is 40, and all other uses is 0, unless that use abuts a residential district, in which case it's 15 feet today for the rear setback. In council's referral, the rear setback was 5 feet, keeping the 15-foot residential caveat. And for the Planning Commission recommendation, the rear yard recommendation was 20 feet, again with a conditional allowance of a 10-foot rear setback through the SUP. In side yards for 1 and 2 family, this is 10 feet today. For townhouses, it's 20 feet for corner lots and 10 feet for interior lots, and all other uses is a 10-foot side yard setback. In the council's referral, it was 5 feet for side yards, and for the Planning Commission recommended 10 feet. For lot coverages, I'll start with impervious surface. There's no restrictions on impervious surface maximums in T-zones today. The council referral also didn't include any impervious maximum specific language. The Planning Commission recommended a maximum impervious surface of 80%. For building coverage, today it's a maximum of 40%. Council referred out an 80% maximum, and the Planning Commission recommended a by right maximum of 60% and a conditional increase to up to 70% through the SUP process. For tree canopy, again, there's no language on tree canopy minimums today in T-zones. The council also did not include tree canopy language in its referral. The Planning Commission recommended a 15% tree canopy minimum in its recommendation. So under environment, I'll start with historic preservation considerations. Today, in the code, there's the Historic and Cultural Conservation District, or the HCC, which requires the marketing of all designated property at fair market value prior to demolition for up to a year's time. And the council's referral did include any historical designation language, so this would uphold and maintain the HCC. And in the Planning Commission's recommendation, that also recommends maintaining the HCC, but also added a stipulation that through the SUP process, that historic structures be have some mandated consideration about their incorporation and inclusion in any redevelopment efforts. For parking, though these are the by right minimum off-street parking requirements today. For single family, it's 1 space a home. Townhouses, it's 2.5 spaces per home. Multifamily, it ranges based on the unit type. And similarly for commercial, it varies by use and size. In the council's referral, this included no changes to what's mandated today by through the zoning code. And in the Planning Commission's recommendation, this includes setting the off-street parking minimum at 1 space per home, including no off-street parking allowed within the front setback, and including electric vehicle or EV charging considerations. For solar, there's no requirements today, and none were included in the council referral. In the Planning Commission's recommendation, this included solar-ready construction considerations as well, similar to EV. So for the districts, today we have 2 T-zones, T1 and T2. The only difference between the two is that T1 allows 1 and 2 family homes. Otherwise, the 2 districts allow the same uses in them. I'll note that only 3 properties in the city are zone T2 and the rest in the city are zone T1. So the council's referral included combining T1 and T2 into a single T-zone district in light of the few differences between them. And in the Planning Commission's recommendation, this also held combining T1 and T2 into a single T-zone district, but also included the recommendation to remove residential uses via in T-zones for properties along North Washington Street, north of Great Falls, and on Park Avenue, all commercial uses fronting Park Avenue would be conditional, so no by right commercial uses on Park Avenue. Moving to affordable housing, there's no affordable housing considerations or restrictions in T-zones today. In council's referral, this included a 10% of all new homes built in T-zones meet affordable and workforce housing AMI requirements. And the Planning Commission recommendation is something a little different. They recommended that a T-zone tax increment financing district, or TIF district, be set up in T-zones only that collects any new tax revenue from redevelopment occurring in those districts. And the delta between that tax revenue would be reinvested into an affordable housing fund that would be applicable citywide. Mr. City Attorney, I don't know if you had if this was the appropriate time that you wanted to comment on this aspect.
Yeah, so, and counsel, I'll defer to you how you want to proceed. I mean, I have some specific legal thoughts on that proposal, but I don't know if maybe the better course would be for staff to finish his presentation, and then we could discuss that when the time's appropriate. But I'll proceed however you want me to.
I think that's a good idea. That's fun.
Wrapping up then. Into project reviews, this is the different review procedures that each kind of use bucket would be subject to. For 1 to 4 family dwellings today, of course, only 1 and 2 family homes are allowed to be built by right, and those are subject to a grading plan submission. 3 to 4 family buildings are not currently allowed use. In the in the council referral, this is NA because 1 and 2 family homes would, of course, become disallowed uses, and there's also no language on triplexes and quadplexes, and so that's non-applicable. In the Planning Commission's recommendation, again, 1 and 2 family homes would be disallowed, new 1 and 2 family homes, and a grading plan submission would be required for triplexes and quadplexes. Because part of that recommendation is that 3 and 4 buildings would be allowed to be built. 3 and 4 family homes would be able to build by right that would follow the envelope of a single or 2 family home. And so that follows the grading plan submission. For townhouse and multifamily, site plans are required for townhouses only because currently multifamily is not an allowable use in T-zones. In the council recommendation, this would be the SUP and the site plan process for townhouses and apartments and condos and otherwise multifamily buildings, and the Planning Commission held the same. For commercial uses, this requires a site plan today. Same is true in the council's referral and in the Planning Commission's recommendation as well. Again, for Park Avenue, this would also require conditional approval on Park Avenue through the SUP process and for taller building heights. So that's all the kind of series of considerations included here. Before I wrap it up, I'll just point to the map on 105, line 105, that shows where the T-zones are today. You can see where T1 and T2 are. So with that, I'll turn back to you, Mr. Mayor.
All right, thanks very much. Mr. City Attorney, did you want to speak to any matter at this point?
Sure, I'm happy to sort of briefly discuss the specific Planning Commission recommendation on the proposed TIF district and redirecting incremental tax revenue to affordable housing generally throughout the city. Just wanted to make a preliminary comment, and this isn't by way of a negative comment, but just want to make clear my office wasn't asked by the Planning Commission to vet this recommendation before it was included in the final series of recommendations. I would go ahead.
I was just going to say, I understand.
Oh, okay. And I was alerted to this by staff and gave them my preliminary view that this was likely impermissible under existing enabling authority in Virginia, at least in the context of how it's being proposed here. I have, since the date of the Planning Commission recommendation, analyzed the issue in more detail, and I am of the opinion that as proposed, this particular recommendation is not permitted under applicable law. I also want to say that I understand there is a desire, and I understand there's a desire to continue to address the ongoing issue of affordable housing, and that somewhat creative solutions are sometimes appropriate, but any potential solution that involves redirecting tax revenue outside of the boundaries of a clearly defined district from where it originates, in this case, it's being proposed to be redirected citywide, in my opinion, is something that would require much additional analysis, including by financial advisors specialized in the nuances of Virginia tax and public finance law and regulations. And this type of proposal might even require additional enabling authority from the General Assembly. Here, there aren't any specific development projects or a project with identifiable development project costs that meet the definitions under Virginia law. By definition, when you're looking at tax increment financing, everyone calls it TIFs, they capture projected increases in real property tax revenue in an area, and they direct all or some of those increases toward mitigation efforts or improvements associated with a particular project or projects, and within the particular district, not elsewhere. So that's a problem with what's being proposed here. In Virginia, for better or for worse, tax increment financing is defined specifically and narrowly. It's applicable to specific development project areas, or less commonly you see it used in specifically defined blighted areas. So for example, I've seen it used, you could have a specific development project or area that might not be capable of being financed completely using traditional financing vehicles. By using a carefully structured TIF, you could capture the incremental tax revenue resulting from development and use that to assist with the cost of specific improvements within the district or resulting from development within the specified development project area. The other issue is that TIFs can only remain in place as long as any specific obligations or development project costs that result in the need for the TIF remain outstanding and unpaid. I have heard of some examples, to be fair, from other jurisdictions in Virginia that have used TIFs in combination with other elements. But my analysis of those examples that have been presented show that they're not really analogous to what's being proposed here. So I just wanted to clarify where we stood from a legal standpoint on this proposal. It's not to minimize it or say that it's not something that might not be a part of a broader discussion on housing affordability in the future. And we'll be happy to continue to look at this if that's the will of the council. But my recommendation at this point is that council not proceed with this specific recommendation from the Planning Commission in the context of the T-zone amendments. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Other than that, you're okay with it though, right? Okay. All right.
Yes.
Mr. Shields, is there any further staff presentation, or should we open it up to comments and questions from council?
That ends the staff presentation.
Okay. Thanks very much. There's a lot here. I know some of us have followed and been to the various meetings and the like on this, but there's still a lot to kind of wade through and digest. So why don't we get to it? Ms. Hiscott?
Yeah, I wanted to start with a quick procedural question on some of the recommendations from Planning Commission, just to clarify how we as council will go about making decisions on those things. For instance, clarifying the business uses. Jack, Mr. Trainer, I believe you mentioned that, it will go back to council to review that. So I kind of want to know how we're going to go about defining business uses, or if there's more specifics recommended from Planning Commission on how to do that. And then also on the EV chargers, which I think is a great idea, is that if we're applying one parking spot per household, that defines it as basically everybody needs to be EV ready. Every parking spot would need to be EV ready, if I understand that correctly.
I'm not sure. So I know there's different levels of EV infrastructure. So I don't know. I don't think the Planning Commission included EV ready specifically, and apologies if I said that, but EV considerations in terms of different levels of EV infrastructure that might facilitate EV spots.
So I guess I have questions on how we go, because there are so many different levels of EV chargers. Like, is that up to council to be deciding specificity, or are we going to go back to the ESC? So questions on how we make some of these decisions of the outstanding issues. And then also along that line with my ESC hat on is solar ready, defining what solar ready means. There's also some broad definitions of what solar ready is, and when you get to the details, there need to be more details of that. So my question really is on those outstanding issues, which I think are great points the Planning Commission brought forward. How do we move forward with making those a reality, or making them into policy?
So, I mean, what I would suggest for purposes of tonight is to go through this chart and give feedback. And there's going to be things that we don't know, right? There's going to be some questions. There's going to be things we ask of you to bring back to us. I'm sure, hey, can you explain this, or can you give us an example, whatever it might be. And just do this as an iterative process. Like, I don't think we're going to wade through all this and everyone's going to feel great about whatever their position might be tonight. But I think we should get through as much as we can. And that's a question that I think needs to be asked and answered. I just don't think it's going to be answered tonight, right? It sounds like that's something
Yeah,
staff's
that's
going to get.
Sorry.
So I might suggest we raise all those questions tonight with the hope that we'll get answers as soon as we're able to, and then be able to, make more cogent decisions and recommendations based on additional information we may get. So does that sound like a plan? Maybe just go through this chart and get people's feedback on sort of, line by line, not sort of line by line, but block by block?
I agree.
Yeah, I think that's what my goal was, the process, not to get answers on each of those, but those are examples of things that will need clarification. And it sounds like council needs to be making those decisions. So what is the process of getting more information back, I guess, to be clear?
So I presume that we're going to have a bunch of questions, or at least some questions tonight, and staff's going to get back to us, hopefully in the fairly near future, depending on the nature of the question. And then we can use those either at the town hall, we can update information potentially, also at our next work session, certainly by first reading on this matter as well.
Mr. Mayor, I would like to talk about process. I think the sense is that this has not been a two-way street, that comments are made by large numbers of citizens, many of whom are here tonight, but there's never been a real dialogue. The comments are made, they're accepted, there's a work session where they can't comment, and then first reading and decisions are made. So I think we really need to look at a process here that really brings the community together. Some progress has been made by the Planning Commission, but I think the process still has not created a kind of broad-based confidence that I'd like to see. So I'm hoping that we can give some serious work on different forms and ways of a dialogue with all stakeholders, so that at the end of the day, we don't have a divided community, but rather a united community moving forward. So that would be point number one. Point number two, regrettably, some of the process has gone off the tracks. Most notably were last-minute comments submitted by the development community, where citizens had almost no opportunity to see those comments, and yet the Planning Commission gave the appearance of making decisions based upon those comments. So that's just an example of process issues where, I think we have an opportunity here to create a process that really brings everybody in the community on board. And as I said, there has been some progress so far, but there's been a lot of unnecessary conflict created because of the failure to really have a two-way street dialogue with all interested parties. So I think process is important, and I think we need more of a process than we've outlined tonight so far. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We've got a town hall planned in about 2.5 weeks. Personally, I'd like to see a second town hall as well to make sure we have an opportunity for folks to get input, allow their input. But if people have additional suggestions, particularly of what you'd like to see, certainly I think we'd all be welcome to hear those things. All right, well, going back to maybe just getting to the heart of the matter tonight, would folks like to maybe go through this sort of block by block and get input from you all, and also questions for staff and responses and requests for additional information and the like? So the first block is this. Sorry? Oh, Phil. Yes, Phil. Hi. Please go ahead.
I don't want to jump in front of the process that you're outlining. I was just going to ask a couple of rifle shot questions, but I can ask them when that spot in the grid comes up.
So, look, I'm not wedded to any process to go through. There's just so much here. We can either sort of take it as catch can, or we could try to go through it in sort of methodical way. I really don't have a preference. It just seemed fairly logical to sort of go through it block by block and either take questions and or comments as we go through. Okay, does that make sense to most people up here? All right, so Phil, if you have a question or comment about the first block, which is residential and commercial uses, I think now would be the time. If not, I guess I would say maybe hold it till we come up to that section.
No, actually, my first question does speak into that area. I just wondered, under commercial uses current, are storage facilities, you store it facilities, are those the kind of commercial uses? Is that a kind of commercial use that would be allowed under the current regulations if it met all the other standards? I just don't see that as a use type. We got inns and bed and breakfast, but storage facilities are, obviously we've got one in the city already and several on our perimeter. I just wondered if that's a contemplated allowed use.
So if you don't know the answer now, it's totally fine to say, I'll have to get back to you. I know you're fairly new, and so, don't be put on the spot.
Sure, yeah, I mean, I will say I don't, as Councilman noted, I don't see it specifically listed on the list here. Something I think we could check with the zoning administrator to see if that would be a similar type use consistent with what is listed here as an allowable use. But yeah, the short answer is I don't know.
If you could maybe just follow up with the zoning administrator,
Absolutely.
that would be great.
My other question in that area is parking lots as a principal use are not allowed by the Planning Commission's recommendation, and as I see it elsewhere, they would be allowed. So that's a difference between the council and the Planning Commission. Is that right? They would not allow principal use parking lots, and the city council would allow it with the language that we passed.
That's correct. This is Paul Stoddard again. They are currently allowed in the code as a principal use, and council didn't provide any change and didn't recommend any changes to that when they referred it out. Planning Commission did specifically cite that one as what they'd like to remove. Of course, accessory parking would still be allowed, meaning if you've got an office building or townhouses or whatever, you can have parking to support that use, but you couldn't just have a lot that was nothing but a parking lot.
Okay, and not to hog the camera, but in the same vein, building coverage lot, maximum 40% under current, would that mean that a parking lot that was a building that took up 40% of the lot would be allowed? Would then surface parking be allowed in addition to the structure, or is that maximum 40% maximum total use of the site?
So there are three terms involved here. There's building coverage is the actual building footprint. So if you just lead with that middle line that's up on the screen now, building coverage is just the footprint of the building. So under current code, the building footprint can take up 40% of the site. Council referral 80%, council referral, Planning Commission recommendation between 60 and 70%. The impervious surface, the line above, goes beyond that. So today, if you could handle the stormwater by the code today, you could have a building that occupied 40% of the site, and the other 60% occupying the entirety of the site could be paved.
Okay.
You'd still have to meet stormwater requirements, but the code would allow it.
Understood. That's where I'm trying to get at. I'm trying to envision, we've heard from some citizens commenting from the mid-city area that, there's not enough parking. I don't happen to agree with that, but everybody's entitled to their opinion. And someday, if there's not enough parking, the market will, address that for us. And right now, the market would be able, if that ensued, the market would be able to build a building as you discuss and a surface parking lot, as long as it captured stormwater to the degree required. And basically, you would have a completely impervious lot with setbacks that are, as indicated, which are fairly modest. I'm just trying to draw a picture in my head of, what some parts of Park Avenue side of Middle City would look like if we went, or if a development went in that direction. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry to take up the mic.
Okay, is that it, Phil, for this section?
Yes.
Okay, Ms. Conley?
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Trainer, for that very clear explanation. In the very first block, it says include a grandfather clause for existing single-family homes. Why is that addition necessary? Because nothing would be forced to be taken down.
Right, right. Nothing would be forced to be taken down. This is in case something happened to the home for those single-family homes that are in a T-zone today. If the house was destroyed, it wouldn't be able to be rebuilt under certain circumstances. And so this grandfather clause would ensure that homeowners with single-family homes in T-zones today would have all the reassurances of their being able to rebuild their home if something happened.
Okay. And is there another term of art than grandfather that we could use?
We'll look into it.
No,
Grandmother,
it's a term that has
grandparent.
an unfortunate.
But even the word grandfather, it's such a specific thing, and it's a shorthand that all of us understand, but
Legally non-conforming is the way you can.
you can say that, or
that is a term,
existing, yeah.
actually. It is a little.
That's my only question on this block. Thank you.
All right. Ms. Hiscott?
Okay, so I just wanted to double down on Mr. Duncan's comments about storage units, having, living close to the ones that were built in Arlington, and it's definitely a use that I would like not to see permitted in any of these transition zones. So confirming that is important, I believe. I like the addition of the parking lot as a principal use also being negated, because clearly the intention is not to put up parking lots. It's to create more homes, it's to create more missing middle housings, perhaps getting some neighborhood retail in, other goals rather than storage units or parking lots. So I think those are great additions. And legally non-conforming, that's also another great catch from Planning Commission. And I just wanted to, let's see, making sure these are, the improving on the impervious is also a great addition. I think the other comments I have are in the next section. So just wanted to reiterate several comments made by my colleagues.
Ms. Hardy?
Thank you. Can we go back up to the single-family home section, Mr. Trainer? I think we covered this elsewhere, but I want to confirm. So in the Planning Commission's recommendation, triplexes and quads are by right, assuming they fit the form and envelope of a single-family home, correct?
Correct.
So they can't go bigger than what's allowed in single-family home?
Correct.
Okay. And the reason for that, I think, is because the Planning Commission believes those are important housing types we don't have, and that's why they want to encourage those.
Yes, those are, I think, an attempt to get some housing diversity by right.
Okay. I support that. Moving on to townhomes in the same section. Oh, are we allowed to go to the section?
Which section is that?
Townhouse, it's right below the 1 to 4.
Yeah, that's this whole block.
And
The whole block is residential commercial uses.
For those of us who don't get paper, we're kind of scrolling.
Okay, well, anyway, yeah. So, yeah, up until building height and
We'll save that.
setbacks.
Okay, so for townhouses, Mr. Train, I think you alluded to this. We don't essentially allow townhomes because we don't have any more 3-acre minimum lot sizes, correct?
That's right.
Okay. Now, let's say someone does assemble something more than 1 acre. Would that then go through the special exception process instead of the SUP process?
Yes.
Okay, so that's an important distinction to call out, I think, because I think that could be a possibility, and I think the SE process is very rigorous and what the community is familiar with today, so I think that's an important note to call out there.
Just a clarifying point on that. To access the special exception process, you need a B zoning. So in addition to the rigor of an SE application, they would also be subject to the review for an associated rezoning application.
Got it. On the commercial uses, I will put a +1 on removing parking lots because I do think that is a terrible land use, even though that is what many of our T-zones are occupied with today. I don't think that is what we desire the future of that to be. I have a question on how mixed use is treated. So we talk about commercial uses and certain by right commercial uses. Let's say you have a 4-story mixed use proposal in your T-zones. How would the ground floor be treated versus the upstairs? Would the entire building be then going through an SUP process depending on how big it is, or would the ground floor be separated from the upper floors?
It's a good question. I might defer to Mr. Stoddard about this, but I think it would be subject to a site plan, the whole development. So I think it would all be kind of considered together as a conditional use.
So at the minimum, probably an SUP process.
Yes.
Mr. Stoddard, do you have any more comments?
Right. If any part of the project requires an SUP, then obviously the whole project would require an SUP. So if someone is considering mixed use with residential and ground floor commercial, then that would trigger an SUP requirement.
So the fear that some of these by right commercial uses would essentially not have any public review is unlikely, given that we don't actually have anybody proposing all commercial uses these days. At the most, we get it in a mixed use form.
Right. And even if it is a by right use, it's still subject to the site plan provisions, which includes public noticing and public meetings and planning commission action before the project can be approved.
Got it.
Go ahead. I'll ask a question later.
Continuing on the commercial uses. So I noted that I think later on in the chart, we talk about how any of these commercial uses on Park Avenue, the Planning Commission's recommending that it's conditional. So even though they're listed as by right, if it's the T-zone in Park Avenue, we're treating Park as unique and therefore would go through the SUP process, correct?
Correct. That's the Plan Commission's recommendation, is that any commercial use would be subject to, on Park Avenue, would be subject to the SUP conditional use.
Got it. So I think that's, again, another important thing to call out in this part of the chart, because I think based on all the comments that I have listened to and read, people view Park Avenue as a special place. And so they want to make sure there's extra eyeballs on it. And so I think that's an important thing to call out, that even though they're by right uses across all of T-zones, if the by right use is on Park Avenue, it would go through the SUP process.
Exactly.
Okay. Okay. I think that's it for this section for me. Thank you.
All right, other comments? Mr. Snyder?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. There are repeated reference to the special use permit process. I wonder if the planning staff could explain to the public what that is, who makes the decision, and what are the standards, and what is the stakeholder, what are the opportunities for neighborhood and stakeholders to weigh in?
Absolutely. So on line 138, we have an outline of the special use permit procedure, and it's side by side with the little longer special exception, another conditional use approval walk through. But yes, the special use permit process is, again, meant to give special review to certain uses. It's meant to be consideration for smaller projects, and so the timeline is a little shorter, but you still hit all of the same kind of review procedures that a special exception would. And so in that right column there's special use permit, there's an initial council work session, there's planning commission and AB preliminary workshops. There's notes given to the applicant. They go back, they resubmit. It comes back to council, for a second work session. Council, would consider it, and then, when council feels comfortable enough with it, would refer it out to the planning commission, and any, subsequent boards and commissions that it feels, appropriate. And planning commission, would have its work sessions and then make its recommendation back to council when it feels comfortable with it. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, council would have its final review of it as well. So that's the special use permit that we're talking about here in T-zones. And so I'm happy to answer any questions about, public opportunities to review or comment in that.
Right, that's helpful. So what is the standard for granting a special use permit?
Let's see, I think there is language towards the end in the code. Mr. Stoddard, do you by chance know what the lines are?
I think it's in the 710s.
This is important because a lot of the recommendations hinge on special use permits. So it's important to get down what that is.
Sure. So line 712. Special use permits go beyond obviously what is allowed by right. And in this case, under state enabling legislation, SUPs can either be approved by the council or the Board of Zoning Appeals. It's in adopting the code, the council chooses which body approves. When you all referred it out, it was to hold that approval to the city council. And obviously that's what staff mapped out in that chart that Mr. Trainer walked through. And then what's on the screen now are the required considerations the council would have to make before voting approval on a proposed project.
So,
And
go ahead.
just a reminder, the code that's up on the screen is what the council had referred out in May of last year.
So the special use permit standards are also up for discussion. Is that right?
Correct.
Yes.
Correct. So what's laid out here is several of them enlarging the city's tax base, promoting the availability of affordable housing, promoting environmental stewardship, and then providing for harmonious design transitions, as well as applying the city's urban design and streetscape standards. But of course, yes, those can be adjusted by council in the code here.
Okay, thanks very much.
Ms. Leon?
I have comments on the commercial uses, particularly the removal of boarding houses and lodging room houses, but yet we're keeping inns, beds, and breakfasts. So what is the staff's distinction between those three unique bullet points currently?
Boarding houses, lodging rooms, and houses and inns?
Compared
Was it?
to inns, beds, and breakfasts that is not proposed for removal.
Right. I think we looked at the technical zoning definition of an inn, and that had certain, I think, bed requirements that were smaller than like a hotel, like the like one of the larger chain ones. So we're thinking more that this definition is a kind of a smaller use in terms of beds and rooms. In terms of boarding houses and lodging rooms, I can't speak too well to those uses or why those were included or removed as they were. But that's something we could get definitions for and come back to.
Yeah, I mean, just Google search. If you look for synonyms for boarding houses, I mean, bed and breakfast, is equitable or related to it. So I think the question is, let's be consistent, right? Because we're allowing inns and breakfasts. If we're allowing inns, bed and breakfast, my sense, appreciate that you follow up on it, is that boarding houses and lodging room houses are smaller footprint than inns. So I just want to make sure we're...
Well, Mr. Stoddard might jump in as well. I think part of the discussion was
Yeah.
simply to modernize the language. Boarding house is just not phraseology that's used very commonly anymore, and so it kind of prompts conversations like this. Mr. Stoddard, was that part of the consideration?
It was. Some of these things aren't commonly seen anymore. I was going to say that these things are, a lot of these uses is just good zoning practice, and a lot of them are. There are actually definitions for all these things in the city zoning ordinance, where it does define boarding house, lodging house, or rooming house as a building other than a hotel, motel, or tourist home where meals, lodging, or both are provided for compensation for 4 to 8 persons, not transients. And so it's a pretty specific box, but I'm not sure that it's actually a business model that anybody's using anymore. And of course, group homes are allowable, which is probably a sort of a better classification for those. And so I think it's just removing uses that people aren't making use of.
Okay. I do support removal of parking lots, so that's the third plus one on that. That helps me put in context as to why we targeted boarding houses and lodging room houses. The intent there wasn't really to create, anything discriminatory or another. It's just normalizing it. What the intended purpose is really just to allow inns, beds, and breakfasts. I get that. Okay.
Right, an inn is also defined. I think it's 12 rooms or fewer, and so this is really seen as a sort of a small, like it says, a small inn or a bed and breakfast.
Okay. That's it for me.
All right. Other questions, comments? I've got one or two. This one may be directed at the city attorney. We're removing single-family duplexes as a possibility. I'm wondering, does that, in some circumstances, not allow a reasonable use of the property? In other words, like a taking, when you've got some of these very small T-zone lots that are essentially the size of a single-family house? I mean, I have that concern. I'm wondering if you share that concern with me.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a concern. I mean, the standard is you need to allow for a reasonable economic use of property. So it's something that we'll continue to look at as this process develops. But for the moment, I'm satisfied with what's being discussed and proposed.
Okay. I have to say, I do have concerns about that, removing single-family and duplexes. I think there are certainly some smaller lots that probably are best suited for that, particularly when you throw in parking and the other requirements of a quad. You know, whether you can get that on a 10,000 square foot lot and do all that in a lot, I doubt it on some of these. I don't know. What is the smallest lot we have in the T-zone? Do you know? Does anyone on staff know that?
Not offhand. In one of the attachments, I believe, we have a list of every single lot with the acreage.
Do we? Okay. What do you know where that is?
One of the attachments included in the.
It's the third from the bottom.
Third, what line?
11, attachment 11.
Oh, God, okay. All right, look, I don't want to belabor this while we're all here. I would just like to make the point that there are some lots, I believe, that either through the shape or the size or other factors are not suited for quads or triplexes. And for those lots in particular, I don't think we can require something that may not be able to be done, and thus depriving a lot owner of reasonable use of their property. It looks like there are some that are, and again, I don't know if these are standalone lots, but some that look like they're less than a fifth of an acre, which some of them are not. I'm looking at some right now that look like they're not. Here's 1.18. I got to say, I think it's going to be a real challenge to put a quad or a triplex on a lot smaller than a fifth of an acre. And so I personally think we should allow and continue to allow singles and duplexes if the owners, for whatever reason, need to do that to make sure they have a reasonable use of their property.
But isn't triplexes and quads supposed to fit in the form of a single-family home?
Well, it could. It may not. If you have parking, you got to park the thing too.
But that's the requirement. To allow triplexes and quads, they have to fit in the envelope of a single-family home.
Yeah, but if imagine the parking may not fit there. You need to have more parking for a quad or a quad than you do for a single-family house. So
right now, we're actually biasing the parking for single-family homes. We only require one space.
yeah, but so you're going to need still with these, as I see this, you're going to need 4 spaces for a quadplex or 3 for a triplex, and on a fifth of an acre, I don't know if you're going to get 3 or 4 parking spaces and the same 4-unit place on that building.
Yeah, I'll save my comments on the parking part when we get to parking, but.
Okay, well, anyway, that's my comment as to continuing to allow singles and duplexes in these lots by right and not take that option away. Let's see what else we've got here. I think we do need to keep considering and looking at the commercial uses to make sure that we've honed this appropriately. And I do have questions about the SUP process that I'd like to know more about, particularly what are the expectations? We have special exceptions right now that include, all sorts of studies potentially. Are those, we have no studies for an SUP process? Do we have expectations of contributions for school capital costs? Are there any, things that we're going to want that we do in special exceptions? I think many of those are protections for the community, albeit for a bigger project. But I think we need to think, do we need some of those protections for some of these smaller projects? Maybe it's 12 units, 16 units. Does that still impact the community? I think the answer is probably yes. So anyway, I guess I would ask that you all consider what kind of expectations you would want to have in the SUP process, either as relates to standards or studies, or also benefits as far as contributions or things like that. And maybe next time we see each other, we can talk a little bit more about how that process might work. Let's see what else we've got. I would again say the SUP should go to council, not to the BZA, but to an elected body that has accountability to the residents, the folks here in this room. So I know that really hasn't come up too much, but you just alluded to it a minute ago, BZA versus city council approval and SUP. I would say that should come to the city council. And that's my position as well. Let's see. That is, I think also what relates to mixed use, I think it would be good to have a little bit more information about how that would work. I know I heard Paul just say that would come as an SUP. It seems like it's kind of an afterthought here, in terms of this chart. I'm not blaming you. You've done a great job with the chart, but I guess I'd like to see a little bit more information about how a mixed-use project might work through this process.
Can we just clarify, SUP has to come to council?
Well, we can decide where it comes. We can decide whether it comes to BZA or council. I think it should come to council, but we can legislate, right, where it goes to. And I believe the legislation should say it comes to city council and continue to say that.
I agree with you.
Okay. So anyway, I think that's all I've got on this first block. Do we want to move on to the second one, building height and setbacks or step backs? Does anyone have any comments there? Mr. Snyder?
Yeah, I do. I'm very concerned about going up to 4 stories or 50 feet. I just don't support that. I think you're running the risk, again, with an SUP process, which is still being crafted, that this would be not an acceptable, quote, transition, end quote, in a lot of cases. So I have a lot of problems with going up to 4 stories or 50 feet under any circumstances.
Other comments on this section? We're talking about building height and step backs. Mr. Duncan?
I think I may either be ahead or behind. My question was about parking on townhouses. Maybe this is just a quick one, not to answer, but the field. Mr. Stoddard or someone, what is the rationale for townhouse parking being 2.5 times single-family home parking? I'd like to, not tonight, but I'd like to understand what was in the thinking of whoever came up with that, whenever they came up with it.
So that's the code as it exists today. Is single family has one space that's not street parking, and then townhouse is required to have 2.5. I wasn't there when that was adopted, but my guess is that maybe because single family is sort of lower density, and that there's perceived to be a lot of curb space that can therefore support parking. So the idea is that single family for families that do have more than one car, they'll just park them on the street.
So it's basically making public a private asset. Okay, well, it's an explanation. It's not a good reason, but it's an explanation. My other question related to the reasonable transition language that you pointed out in line 700, whatever it was. I can see that there's quantitative ways to measure whether something is compliant with the streetscape standards, but what is a harmonious transition, and is that something that is in the eye of the beholder? I mean, some of the public comments that I've read and heard suggest that some of the transitions that we have now are non-harmonious, but my only way to measure that is, are the property values continuing to hold or increase as they would in other places in the city? And I'm just wondering, is there any standard of harmonious transition that's not simply in the eye of the beholder?
I think it's always going to be something of a judgment call. And I think this is the reason sort of the Planning Commission landed where it did. If you look at the sort of the commercial line as sort of an example where they set a by right height of either 3 stories or 40 feet, that's actually lower than the by right height that's available in T-zones today. And so by right, the planning commission said, well, maybe the building should only be 40 feet, sorry. But if you're coming in for an SUP, where council can give appropriate sort of consideration and judgment of the design of the project, then there are some sites where 4 stories or 50 feet would make sense, and there are some sites where that won't make sense. But rather than trying to define one height across the board, allow a slightly lower height and then allow through a discretionary process for a taller building where it's warranted.
Okay, well, sounds to me like it is in the eye of the beholder, and I support the mayor's beliefs that the prime group responsible for the beholding should be the city council, which has the most experience and, in my view, expertise in making those decisions on behalf of the community. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so Ms. Hiscott?
I just wanted to go back to the point that Mr. Stoddard just made, that I'm praising Planning Commission again, but they've come back with options that are actually by right are lower in building height than are currently allowed. By right commercial 3 stories or 40 feet versus 3 stories or 45 feet. Anything greater than that would have to come through this process, which I think I'm hearing some consensus around, would have to come through council to determine if it's the right place, it's the right project, it's the right look, is it harmonious to go any further than 40 feet. So it's actually reducing the by right height, which I think is a really important clarification that the Planning Commission made. Thank you.
Ms. Hardy?
Yeah, to pile on, I agree. I think I appreciate the Planning Commission's kind of thorough and thoughtful kind of evolution of this. So right now we allow 3 stories and 45 feet. And if I were to pair this with one of the later blocks based on one of the by right commercial uses, it could be 3 stories, 45 feet, no rear yard setback, and it could be a parking garage done by right today. And what's being evolved is by right 3 stories, 40 feet. And if you want to go taller than that, 4 stories or 50 feet. So I think it's actually pretty reasonable. So appreciate both staff as well as the Planning Commission's thought on that. I support it as stands. Thank you.
Other comments? Sure, Ms. Conley.
I'll just agree with Ms. Hardy and Ms. Hiscott there on that one. I think that's the right way to go.
Mr. Snyder?
Yeah, so two comments. First of all, the fact that that the proposal may be better than we have today is a red herring. The fact of the matter is, what should it be now that we've opened up the T-zones? And I think we need, number one, some diagrams to people to show the absolute build-out under a special use permit, because we know that just like special exceptions, they've been granted very generously by the city council in the past. And so I think we need some serious diagrams for the community to really understand what the ultimate maximum build-out. And I continue to be very concerned about the maximum build-out that the Planning Commission is permitting.
Okay, I've got a couple questions or comments. So talking about building height, would these numbers also apply in Washington?
Yes.
So
These are
50
across
foot is the
T-zones.
maximum on Washington?
In a T-zone, correct, yeah.
Okay. I mean, so let's say someone wanted to develop some of the buildings we've done along our major commercial corridors, which are substantially higher than 50 feet along the main roads. How would they go about doing that?
Getting additional height.
Well, yes. I mean, I'm not talking about some of the neighborhood things, but I think on our major commercial streets, 50 feet is not much if you're building a building on a commercial thoroughfare, such as the Whole Foods site or, things like that. So I'm curious, would they seek a rezoning then to be, and you don't have to answer this, maybe Paul or someone else, but if someone wanted to build your typical building that we've seen on our major commercial corridors, not on our side streets, not on Park, not on a residential street, but along the major commercial corridors, would they seek a rezoning to a B zone? I don't know if that's Paul or the city attorney or someone.
I believe they would constitute a rezoning, but I'll let Mr. Stoddard weigh in on that.
Yeah, you mentioned North Washington, and I'll just sort of throw in the importance of the small area plans. That's actually something that was guiding the Planning Commission in their review of this. But, the North Washington Street corridor, just to pick an example, is identified as being a future commercial corridor for the city. And it is through the special exception process that the city has been able to get committed commercial components to projects. And so the thinking is that if there is going to be a sort of a larger scale development, then a rezoning to a B and pursuing an SE application would be a way to ensure consistency with that small area plan. Of course, people always have access to the by right options they have, but if they wanted to do a bigger building, then an SE process would put in sort of the proper reviews and design criteria.
So I guess I would just say, maybe ask you give some thought to how to sort of plan technically for that. In other words, what we wouldn't want to happen is someone sort of underutilize a commercial area because it maybe is easier, quicker, or whatever, but we want them to go through that process so that we can get the kind of things we get as far as studies, traffic studies, traffic demand management, parking things, all sorts of things we get through the SC process. And so I would hate to have one of our main commercial areas on Washington, for example, build something like this, kind of quote by right, and not allow it to go through the special exception process. So I guess I would just maybe offer to you or suggest to you to give some consideration how we could steer that to what we've already planned for through our small area plan and not allow someone to maybe sort of shortcut that through this process of something maybe that we don't want to see ultimately there. So
That is something we were trying to think about. If we're able to go to the top of page 8, it's line 105. It's the T-zone map. So there are sort of two sort of design controls built in. First is one that council had included in the referral, and that is that the access to multifamily would only be available for sites less than 1 acre in size. And then the second, if we can keep the whole map on. And then the second is that the access to multifamily through the T-zones would not be available along Washington north of Great Falls, which is the bulk of the purple. It's the property owned by Columbia Baptist Church, as well as the purple properties across the street on the sort of southeast side. Those are generally the larger acreages along North Washington. And so by disallowing sort of T-zones to develop along that commercial corridor as townhouses, it does steer them to a vision that's more consistent with the small area plan commercial uses, either the commercial that's allowed in T-zones or getting that rezoning and committing to commercial uses.
So I would just say this, someone may have larger than an acre, but they can subdivide it and put it into 2 LLCs or all sorts of things. So I wouldn't use that to hang too much your hat on. But I guess, not to belabor this, I would just say maybe give it some additional thought to how we can make sure this is written so that people don't shortcut or short circuit our overall long-term plans and the processes we've developed over a number of years to protect the community and to ensure that we get benefits as a city associated with to mitigate new developments. A couple others here. Just a question or two. You talk about step backs. Where are the step backs? What sides of the building? All sides of the building? Where do the step backs fall in this section?
I can take it, Mr. So right now, the step backs, there's none today, right, in T-zones, but in the council referral, the step backs would take place 10 feet behind the face of the building.
But on which side? On the front, the back, the sides? Where?
Right now, any part of the building that fronts a residential district.
So if you're across the street from a residential district.
I believe that would apply.
That would apply. If you're next to a residential district, that's side only.
Yeah.
Correct? It's not all the sides.
Right.
Just that particular side that faces that. So
correct.
If you got residential only on one side, that side has a 10-foot step back. If you got somebody in the back, only that side. If you got it on 3 sides, those 3 sides.
Correct.
Is that correct?
That's correct. That's what's in the council referral. Planning Commission's recommendation had 10-foot step backs on all street fronts. Okay. Regardless of
so all street frontages and still when it faces on the sides or the back. Okay. Okay.
If I could interrupt, this has caused us to do some research into the way the zoning ordinance is structured, that it's very common for the zoning ordinance to say 10 feet adjacent to an R district. And that includes R1B, R1A, but also RTH, RM, the townhouse and multifamily districts. But it doesn't include buildings with an approved special exception, that those are still sitting in an underlying B district. And so as written, either in the council referral or then the planning commission's recommendation, there wouldn't be a requirement for that 10-foot step back adjacent to a project with an approved special exception.
So that would be, so if you have a approved special exception, even if you're using it as a residence or residential use, multifamily residential condos, apartments or whatever, that would not be considered, quote, residential for purposes of the step back?
Correct. It's the underlying zoning district, yeah.
Gotcha, not necessarily the use. So people may think that applies to them because they're using it residentially, even though technically it's a mixed-use project by special exception in B zone.
Correct.
Okay. All right, that's something I think maybe we might want to give some additional consideration to. I just want to maybe put a pen in that. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that. But so what essentially we're hearing is that you may be next to a residential building, but that wouldn't qualify for the step back because it's not zoned residentially, even though it's being used residentially. So, okay. Does anyone have additional comments on that section, or should we go to lot coverage?
One thing for me.
Yes.
I do appreciate planning commissions and staff comments on this. I think, Mr. Mayor, you have a good point on that. But overall, for this particular section, I think it's a good middle ground.
Mr. Snyder?
Yeah, so I have a lot of issues with the front yard, rear yard, and side yard setback proposals. I'm sorry, did I?
No, I'm sorry,
We're still
turn?
in step backs. We haven't moved to setbacks. We're still in step backs.
Yeah, so this is building height and step back.
No, I understand.
All right, so
I thought we were finished with step backs.
we are, but the next one is lot coverage.
Right.
So you had a comment on lot coverage or on setbacks?
Well, it says front yard, rear yard, side yard. Are you pursuing through the chart?
Those
The
are
chart
step-
I have.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me just see.
Yeah.
Oh, that's setbacks back there. So, yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't see that in the bottom of the page. So we are on setbacks, not step backs. My apologies to everybody. We are on setbacks. So anyone have comments about setbacks?
I bet you can't say that 10 times
No, I
fast.
probably can't say it once. All right, would anyone like to comment about setbacks?
Yes, I would.
Okay.
I'm very concerned about all of these. I realize developers have said they don't like them, but I believe our objective here ought to be to represent our citizens and not enrich developers. So I think we ought to seriously review all of these setbacks. I think they're way too generous in terms of build out.
All right, other comments about setbacks? So I want to ask a question while maybe someone's thinking about asking a question. What's that? Yeah, I'm thinking. Okay. Can you give us an idea what the setbacks currently are in some of these neighborhoods? For example, on Park, what is the current setback on some of the various projects so we can get an idea?
Sure. So included in the staff report, we included some examples of nearby, kind of comparable projects that were built, and also some that didn't get built, with some setback information on line 269. We have some measurements of the Great Forest Townhomes on Park in Pennsylvania, as well as the Madison homes. So those setback information is there. I think also further down in the staff report, we have a larger table, as well as kind of a broken down section of different zoning districts, like the townhouse residence and cluster residential in the city, as well as some comparable other districts and other places.
Thank you.
I wonder if we might just spend some time walking through those, just so people get a sense of, where different yards come into play. Can we go back up to line 269? So this is, and I don't know if we can squeeze the project down a little, the zoom level down a little bit, so the whole There we go. So these are the townhouses on the north side of Park Avenue, at the corner of Park Avenue, which is running diagonally along the bottom of the screen here, and then Pennsylvania going sort of up the screen. The front yard so nuances of the zoning ordinance from a development site perspective. This would actually have two front yards, one along Park Avenue and then one along Pennsylvania, and then because that makes it a corner lot. The other 2 yards become what are called side yards. So here, the 2 front yards along Pennsylvania and Park Avenue both have 25 feet. And that's, of course, from the parcel boundary to the closest point of any building. The 2 side yards then, the longer side yard to the north is about 30 feet. And then the shorter side yard on the east side is about 57 feet. Part of the reason for that large side yard setback is because there's a drive aisle there. The acreage, now worth noting, this acreage here is about 2 acres, so about twice the size of what could be approved under the SUP process as proposed. And in part, the age of the construction as well as the acreage of the project is what leads to a lower building coverage, in this case about 26%, and then a site impervious coverage, buildings plus driveways, walkways, of 43%. If we go to the next one, this is another set of townhouses. This is again on Park Avenue, hanging off the south side. This is on the back of the Spectrum project, so not the commercial townhouses, but the residential townhouses. There's a central walkway down the middle, and then the townhouses are side loaded off the central walkway with the end units pointed to face the street. And here the setbacks, I might go through these just a little differently from how they're printed. What's shown here is the 20-foot is the interior front yard, so the distance from the front door to the central walkway. But thinking of it from a site level, it would actually have a 17-foot front yard. So from the property line along Park Avenue to the front of those first townhouses, 17 feet. Because it does have one front yard, it has a rear yard. The rear yard to the south, it's labeled as side south, but it would be the rear yard from a zoning perspective. It's 8 feet between the closest point of the building edge and the property line. And then along either side, there are setbacks of 31 feet and 20 feet respectively. And again, part of the motivation for those wide setbacks is incorporating the drive aisles. These are more recently constructed. It is on a smaller acreage, about 1.2 acres, still a little bit larger than what's being contemplated here. But now the building coverage is up to 50% and the impervious coverage up to 68%. And then if we go to the next 2 projects, these are actually 2 that couldn't get approved. When I spoke earlier to the trouble of trying to fit a T-zone into sort of an SE process, the SE process typically motivates larger projects, and ultimately they become sort of larger than can make its way through the review process. This is Broad and Spring. It was going to be the Tradition Homes project with commercial condo on the ground floor with the building owners and then residential commercial above. But here the 2 front, again, a corner lot, so the 2 front yards would have been 20 feet along Broad, 17.5 feet along Spring. And then the side setback would have varied along the east side because of the diagonal lot line between 10 and 13.5 feet. And on the south, it would have been 20 feet. Acreage just under 0.7 acres, building coverage and impervious coverage both at approximately 66%. Here, the shape of the lot really lended itself to having a larger open space, although it wouldn't necessarily be usable. It's just a function of the way the building tilts in relation to the lot lines. And then the next project is also one that was considered but not approved. This is the proposal for a condo building at the corner of Park and Lee. And here it is a rectangular shaped lot, so it is possible with building design to push that out closer to the edges, and that's what was proposed. With 2 front yards along Park and Lee of 16.3 and 16.1 feet respectively. And then the 2 side yards, because again, this is a corner lot, the 2 side yards of 3 feet to the east and 10 feet to the south. Acreage about 0.7 acres. But again, because it's a rectangular lot, building coverage can get quite a bit higher. And the proposed building coverage was 87%. And so these We picked these 4 examples because they're local, either because they were reviewed locally or they actually constructed locally. And it's a nice way to visualize how setbacks and lot coverages and acreages sort of play together on a variety of lot shapes.
All right, thank you. Yes, sure, Mary Beth.
Mr. Stoddard, line 290, the Madison Homes at Park Avenue, is that really 50% building coverage on that lot? Seems like a lot more.
We can certainly double check the calculations. You meant the previous example, right?
The Madison Homes at Park Avenue. Just as I look at that, it looks like a lot more than 50% is covered by roof.
I think you've seen some of the drive aisles may appear
And more
like
than, anyway, just, you did the math, I didn't, but just visually, I was surprised to see that said 50% and 68%.
Got it. Yeah, we'll double check the numbers.
Ms. Hardy?
Thanks, Paul. So if I can try to sum up walking through that, that was actually helpful to see some real life examples. So when we go back to the Great Forest examples, I quickly Googled it. That was built in 1989. And so as obviously land got more expensive, which has been happening especially acutely in the past 15 years here, developers have had to go increase on the impervious coverage and increase the building coverage. Is that generally a good summary? It's obviously something like 1989 when we were allowed only 43% impervious coverage. We had a handful of townhomes here.
Correct. You can see that in single family development as well. The original Ramblers that went, well, not the original Ramblers, but the 1950s Ramblers that went in throughout the city are generally smaller in scale than what's being built today. And same with the strip commercial that was constructed in the 60s. The FARs in the commercial area range from 0.1 to 0.2. But then when people come back to redevelop the same land, you have to sort of overcome the value of what's already there, as well as make value on the redevelopment as well.
Yep, and using Great Forest as an example, when I Googled it, there's actually a home for sale for $1.255 million, which I think is, obviously above the median home value and not one of the goals of what we want to do in T-zones. And so if we have essentially a goal that says we want really generous setbacks, really low building impervious coverage, in order to make the economics work, given high land values, you end up creating homes that are really, really expensive to pay for. And while I know that we perceive developers to, be evil and need to make a lot of money, they are producing housing that we need. I disagree that we necessarily need housing at the $1.2 million, because that's, some of what we see in the single family neighborhoods. And so if we actually want to have housing in that middle income band, I think it's kind of necessary to look at setbacks, building coverage, impervious coverage that the Planning Commission's recommended, just based on underlying economics that we've walked through here.
I would just suggest that just because you have less of a setback doesn't mean you're going to get a more affordable house. It's very possible you'd get a bigger house that actually costs more. So that may be a conversation for another moment. But anyway, are you done, or do you have go on to Mr. Snyder?
I think I'm done for now. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Snyder.
Thanks. I think it would be really helpful, again, for the planning staff to prepare a schematic that shows the maximum build out, the maximum permissible lot coverage, so that we have some idea of what could really happen here, number one. Number two, we're allowing not just single-family homes, but we could have quads and other things within the framework of a single-family home. So the argument that we're not permitting multiple houses here or multiple homes is not a correct argument, number one. And number two, again, I come back to the fact that our objective should not be to enrich developers, but rather get what we want and what our citizens say we need and want.
Other comments? Mrs. Connolly.
You go first, that's fine.
Okay, somebody pick here. Ms. Connolly, how about you go?
No, okay, that's fine. Sorry. I have several trains of thought going, so I'm trying to make sure I get them at least sequential here. On providing homes, number of homes, like if there are 3 or 4 that are within one building area, we are providing more homes within the same envelope, within the same district, and we're providing homes for people who currently find it difficult to live here. So we are also, in addition to representing residents, we're representing the future of the city, and where we want to provide housing that people who are teachers here, people who work for the city can afford to live in. So I think it's dual tracking to make sure it fits within our city and fits within a harmonious transition as we define it, but it's also providing physically more housing. So we have more people who are able to live in Falls Church City. So I think that's where, to Letty's point about the density and setbacks and height, they are important to be able to build housing that provides for more options than single-family homes. Or the original intent is that it's not all, 10-story apartment buildings, but we provide this transition literally between residential and business, but a transition between a single-family home and an apartment as well. So I think that's really important that we don't lose sight of the purpose of what we're trying to do here, or at least the motivation of this process. I'll let Mary Beth talk, and then I can come back to the next train of thought.
Ms. Conley?
My question is just about the setbacks, and I'm wondering, has there been any thought to the aggregate of setbacks between two lots? So if you have a lot, an existing lot that has a 5-foot or 0-foot lot line, have we thought about saying that the one that is next to it has to have a larger lot line than that? Not a lot line, a larger setback than that? Or is that completely against all property rights and we're zoning differently? But as we talk about, the rear yard is a 20-foot, the Planning Commission's proposed rear yard is 20 feet with a reduction to 10 feet via SUP. In that SUP, is there a way to say, if there's an existing property that has a 0 setback or a 5-foot setback, then the city council could require that the new property has a larger setback?
Well, yeah, so there are, other examples of when the setback changes, for instance, when it abuts a residential district. So I think there's precedent for that. Within T-zones, though, is that kind of what you're getting at? Or if a T-zone abuts
I'm just thinking about the
zoning
T-zones along Park Avenue. If there's existing uses there in the B-zone that have a 0 property line or a 5-foot setback.
built right up to the lot line.
Exactly. Then the houses on Park Avenue, anything built on Park Avenue, could we require that there's more flexibility in what they're allowed to do as opposed to the one on South Washington Street that has a different kind of setback next to a different kind of residential? Does that make sense?
Might be a question for our zoning administrator,
Yeah.
but I know that there's precedent for when you're talking about different uses abutting each other or different zoning districts.
Right.
I'm not sure about what might be legal if we're talking about just looking at existing uses
I'm thinking about
versus the zoning
the
district.
aggregate. It reminds me of a soccer game. Like the aggregate score is what your scores are in 2 different games. So the aggregate setback would be what's between those 2 different properties. I don't know.
I think it's a concept we could look into. It's a little tricky when your property rights vary based on what your neighbor either does or doesn't do first.
Right,
That can be a difficult situation.
Okay, let's go to Ms. Leon, and then we'll go back to you, Ms. Hiscott.
I think we need to be thoughtful that when we establish these setbacks, setting them at a higher percentage is going to possibly result in smaller lots having less usable buildable space. The higher these setbacks, front, rear, and side go, you're going to encourage consolidation of these lots. So what I would love staff to be able to do is do an analysis, right, on a half-acre lot, or, I've seen 0.08, I've seen 0.18. We have the data on acreage in T1, T2 zones. Compute that into square footage and overlay the square footage that's available for building based on if it's a 20-foot setback, 10-foot setback, the way it's proposed now, including the impervious coverage, and help us understand, is it really going to be realistic based on what we're proposing? I absolutely think
that reality, pragmatic math check, right, on just volume, just that analysis is definitely a must-have before we come, as part of getting ready for first reading, so we understand or better visualize what this all means, right? It's important that when we talk about this, that we do it with a purpose to encourage, the change in the land use that we want. And what I don't want is overly restrictive setbacks that discourage the original goal of what we're trying to do in these T-zones, which is promote good land use, right? Allow increasing diversity of housing supply. So I hope that makes sense. Let me know, council members, if you have thoughts on that or whether you think that would be a good analysis.
Well, to my mind, I think the goal is a worthy one, increased diversity of housing. I'm afraid that some of the things we're doing are blunt tools that don't necessarily direct to that. For example, if you could pull up the image of the townhouses we just looked at a second ago. I can't remember what they're called, not the Madison Home, but the other ones. So, for example, imagine the setbacks were smaller than that on the sides that were smaller. Would you get a different housing type or just get a bigger townhouse or more townhouses? Would they be more $1.25 million townhouses? Is that what we're looking for? Is that acceptable if that were to be what comes out of this T-zone review? We get a whole bunch of $1.2 million townhouses. Is that what we're looking for? And if so, that's okay, if that's the goal. But if the goal is a more diverse type of housing, then I think we need to think about what are the tools, a more precise way to try to encourage that. And I don't know if there is a more precise way, but I'm afraid that some of the things we're doing will not lend themselves to the things people are seeking because the tool is blunt and the market wants what it wants. Maybe it doesn't want $400,000 small units because the market doesn't build any of those. We don't see a lot of those around here, and probably because the market wants a more luxury, higher end, larger product. I'm guessing that. And so I think we just need to be careful that what we do aims towards the goals that we seek, and that we don't end up in this image on the screen with a narrower setback that just means a bigger townhouse. Instead of 22 feet, it's 24 feet or 26. And so to my mind, that's something I think we need to spend some more time on is how is what we're trying to do, the tools that we're trying to use, going to accomplish the goals that we have? And are we going to have something different than we think we're going to get because we're using blunt instruments, basically? So anyway, I think what you've suggested is a reasonable request of staff, but I also think we have to have the bigger picture in mind as well. And are there tools that staff can recommend to try to direct things more to what people seem to want to get, which I believe are smaller, more diverse housing types, as opposed to creating boxes which may get filled up with luxury townhouses, which may be not what people want. But anyway, Ms. Hiscott?
A couple of things. All townhouses would go through the SUP process. So if we are getting a deliverable that we don't want, that's an opportunity to say, no, we want more affordable, whether it's a percentage or we want smaller units. I mean, we can say no to 24 $1.5 million townhouses.
I don't know. I guess I'd want the city attorney to weigh in on that. Can we say if someone comes in filling our box up that your price point is too high, we're not going to approve that?
Well, there are other reasons we haven't approved SUP projects.
Yeah, there'd have to be other reasons for not approving, but that particular example would be problematic.
And one of the other things I want to mention is that I can't remember if it's in this deck, it's in one of the decks that I've seen, there are schematics about what the maximum coverage, the maximum height. There are examples of that if you want to go see what, it's not with trees in it, but it's the drawings, the staff has already done a lot of that work. So that exists. That was one of the requests earlier from my colleagues. So that's out there.
Ms. Hardy?
Thank you. So before we lose Caroline's good idea, I agree that we essentially need to do the math test between coverage and setbacks and vary it by lot size to validate that it's possible. So I would like to see that +1 on that request. The second request, and I was saving this for the end, is when we get through all the height, setbacks, coverage, et cetera, is we also need to market test it, right? And I would love to see it market tested with builders who build the kind of product we want, who work outside of Falls Church. Paul, I think my understanding from our last chat that this has been under way. I think the public would probably benefit from hearing that input. Because I do think that between the math test and then the market test, both of those important pieces of information. The third request I have to respond to Dave's question about, we don't want the $1.5 million townhome being built is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe with the cottage zoning ordinance, we cap the sizes of the cottages. Do we have the ability, and Brian, you don't have to give me the answer now, but I guess I'd like that as a follow-up, is do we have the ability to cap the size of the units that get built in T-zones so that they are naturally more affordable if they're smaller?
Yes, and we've taken that question in, and we'll be ready to answer that at an appropriate time.
Great. So those are my three requests as it relates to while we're on, height, setbacks, coverage, et cetera. So thank you.
I think that's a very good question. Mr. Snyder?
I guess my only comment in addition to the three is what the community wants, what the community, not only what the city council wants, but what the community wants.
All right. Are there other comments on setbacks, or can we move on to lot coverage? Lot coverage? Mr. Snyder?
Same issues, way too much, and it needs a whole lot more work.
Other comments? If you want to ask something while you're eating. Did Mr. Duncan have a question?
If I could, I'd like some comparison, I suppose, of new single-family home development in the city and the lot coverages there as they compare to this. I mean, my impression of, some of the single-family homes that are going up is that folks' windows on the side are within arm's reach of folks' windows right next door. And I'm just curious as to what the market is telling us about expectations of proximity and privacy and views, and so forth. So even if it's just the windshield survey of some of the newer houses, or even some of the houses like along Lincoln Street on the west end of town, which I know there's one for sale in the paper today for $1.5 million or something, which is, just right next door practically. I mean, right across the fairly narrow driveway from the other $1.5 million on Lincoln. Again, we hear from folks who have expectations of views and privacy and so forth that they had in their head when they bought their unit 20 years ago, and some attitudes have changed and some construction has changed to reflect those attitudes. I just want to make sure that we are coming up with standards that are realistic to the market, because at the end of the day, it's more important that what we do have some connection to the market than just a exercise that we are going through here that would not yield any kind of new housing being built, in my opinion.
Ms. Hardy?
I often use the analogy that I think that T-zones should be like the Goldilocks, right? The middle, so not too hot, not too cold for your porridge. So I think for all the coverages, based on what we allow in our R districts, and I think Phil's observation that people max out at the 35% coverage in the R districts to make the most of those that land, and then what we allow in our B zones with the larger buildings feels appropriate. I think the Planning Commission's recommendations I am comfortable with.
So go ahead. Ms. Conley?
Just a quick question on tree canopy. Is the tree canopy suggested here a minimum of 15% suggested by the Planning Commission? Is that comparable to single-family zoning or the R zones?
It's more.
I believe so.
The R zone requirement is a little higher. The 15% recommended here is the maximum allowed under state code. So the state has set limits on how many trees localities can require, and it's based on the zoning district. So lower density residential can require up to 20%. Commercial zoning can require a max of 10%. And then sort of moderate density residential sits in between with a 15% maximum. So this 15% is the maximum under state code that can be required.
Thanks.
Ms. Leon?
I appreciate what the Planning Commission is also saying here, and particularly the tree canopy minimum 15%, because I take a look at Section 290, the Madison Homes at Park Avenue, and I take a look at that example where it's got impervious coverage at 68%, which is, less than the max 80 that's allotted here, but I don't see a lot of trees. Or maybe it's hard to tell what the trees are. So it would be great to support that tree canopy section in the lot coverages. So I'm fine with this section also.
So, Ms. Hiscott?
Yeah, just in speaking with my colleagues on the ESC, and I think you, Letty, on the UFC, that adding the tree canopy at our maximum availability actually improves what we have in the T-zones, as well as providing a maximum of impervious surfaces. I think that also came from the ESC, so that we would actually improve on several of the lots, not all, but several of the lots, with requiring tree canopy and maximum impervious surface. And I think it's good to have that example of 68% coverage, so we can see what that looks like under the building coverage. Again, Planning Commission made some great recommendations, so I'm in support of the recommendations they've made.
Mr. Snyder?
Yeah, I'm interested in what the urban forester has to say about the tree canopy. Obviously, with our challenges with stormwater, one of the best things you can have is the roots of the trees, and in addition to the other benefits. So I'm interested in what the urban forester has to say about it. And I note, again, that the by right maximum of 60% is a good one, but I see that it can be raised to a maximum of 80%, which strikes me as too high. Thank you.
I think you're looking at, so the one is building coverage, the other one is impervious surface, which would be like driveways and things like that added on to it.
Right.
So let me
chime in on that. So I'm the liaison to UFC. I think the arborist concurred that given that the maximum we can require for tree canopy is 15%, he supported that.
So let me ask a question or two. On our mixed-use projects, our large mixed-use projects, what is the impervious surface on those approximately? I mean, you think, oh, it's 100%, but it really isn't. I mean, most of our mixed-use projects have some open space, some green space, et cetera. Do you have any idea or examples of recent mixed-use projects, what kind of impervious coverage there is?
I might shoot that one over to Mr. Stoddard, who might be able to talk about more recent project details.
We can get those numbers. We don't have them offhand. I know we've started tabulating those, but we don't have them ready tonight.
Okay. My hunch is that these numbers feel a touch high. My guess is our major developments on our major streets are in the 90% impervious coverage, which is not that far off from 80%. And so I would be curious as to what those percentages are. In other jurisdictions, for example, you need to have, 10% landscape, even in major commercial things, you need 10% landscape, which gets you to 90%. That would be my hunch, but I would love to see some information about some of our recent projects, what those numbers are. And that would, I think, will influence me on what number this should be. But, it should be between our major commercial project numbers and our residential, single-family residential. What is that? Where do we split that? I don't know just yet. Feels a touch high to me, what we've got here. But anyway, let me also just take a step back. What is our streetscape width on some of these streets it relates to setback and the like? What is our streetscape standard? Is it 14 feet, a 6-foot sidewalk with an 8-foot plant? What is refresh my recollection on these side streets?
I might also give that one to Mr. Stoddard.
Ooh, We have, so the streetscape standards do call for varying widths, sometimes as small as 14. Broad in Washington, it calls for 20, and then some of those side streets at 16 or 18. But there's always a call for a tree panel closest to the curb line, and then a walkway somewhere between 6 and 10 feet wide, and then a small building zone to allow for door swings or seating, something like that.
Got it. I think in some ways the setback or setback is somewhat dependent on that as well. In other words, if you have a larger streetscape, as you say, you don't really want a door swing into or other things. You want a shy zone. You want a little bit of space. So anyway, I'll just throw that out as well. I don't want to belabor that. Why don't we move on then to our next section, which is the environment. Do people have comments about the environment?
Just,
Oh, I'm sorry, did I skip something?
well, it's parking's in there.
Where is parking at?
It's in between historical preservation and solar.
No, that's an environment. Parking's an environment.
Yeah, parking's underneath environment. Parking's underneath environment. So, environment?
So
Yes.
I just have a question on the historical, the HCC, the Historical Conservation and Culture and Conservation District. How many places does the HCC intersect with the T-zone?
So there are there's 4 designated properties that fall within T-zones. One's on Great Falls Street. I think it's currently single-family home, and the other 3 are on North Washington Street, kind of surrounding Sunrise. And I think they're all being used as commercial uses right now.
So what we're proposing to do is more or less restrictive than the current commercial zoning.
So it would be more, it would add further consideration. So right now with the HCC just requires that the property owner put the property on the market at fair market value, and after a year's time passes, then any redevelopment plan would be able to proceed. I think what the Planning Commission's recommendation is to add some further consideration about conserving the properties and having some further weight behind their inclusion in any redevelopment efforts in order to encourage their preservation and not demolition in any redevelopment, even after that year's time may pass. If that makes sense.
Yes, so then I'll just say, so what we're proposing is more likely to preserve some historic properties.
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
That's the intent of that recommendation.
Other comments on this section?
Just on solar and EV, just to reiterate that if we can get some clarification about what you're proposing the requirements would be on EV and solar, that would be great.
Other comments on the environmental, Ms. Hardy?
So back to parking. I think Phil's earlier question or concern I share. So it seems like we are essentially penalizing townhomes and benefiting single-family homes and letting single-family homes essentially have the benefit of using street parking, right? So we're only requiring that single-family homes have one space on the property, and then essentially you can use the street. But we're not allowing that for other kinds of housing. Is that right, Paul?
So I can certainly speak to the numbers, and yes, so generally an owner-occupied housing in the city typically has, 2/3 of owner-occupied homes in the city have 2 or more cars. Certainly there are plenty of single-family houses that have 2 or even 3 car garages. But certainly there are older homes in the city where, there's 1 parking space in the driveway, maybe 2 if they do it tandem. But certainly, curb lane parking remains popular throughout the city.
Yeah. It just doesn't make sense to me because I guess you presume that a single-family home, like you said, has actually more cars than some of the other units. And so I separately have issues with that. So look forward to the revamp of hopefully our parking requirements. And I guess I would look to our parking utilization in our newer buildings to inform the requirements. And I think that's where the Planning Commission ended up, given that our current utilization has been below 1 space per home. Is that correct, Paul?
Yeah, that's the numbers that come out of our Commissioner of Revenue. We've compared the number of vehicles registered in the apartment buildings against the number of units in the building, and even when they hit full occupancy, they're still they're still registering cars at less than one space per unit.
Okay. And in case, I guess, staff is keeping track, I support, I think, what Mary Beth's questions was on historic preservation. If this encourages more preservation, I think those recommendations are sound to me, as well as parking and more clarification on the solar and the EV stuff, I think would be helpful. But otherwise, I support it.
Ms. Hiscott?
Just have one question on the Planning Commission's parking note, setting required off-street parking at minimum one space per home. I interpreted that as one space, like a townhouse is a home. So that would be changing the townhouse parking requirement to just one versus 2.5. Am I misunderstanding?
That's correct.
Okay. Just wanted to clarify that point.
Other comments? Ms. Conley?
One parking question. The Planning Commission also recommends no off-street parking allowed within front setback. Does that mean a driveway? They're not going to be allowed to have a driveway that they pull into?
The parking, the car couldn't be parked in the front, but I think a driveway could cut through to the rear and be parked behind the building.
Okay.
Yeah, so the idea, you can see different styles of townhouse construction, how they lay out on the site. The idea is to avoid a situation where the units all front onto the street and then each one has their own curb cut and driveway, which essentially eliminates all the curbside space. So instead, it would be better to have a site layout where there is, sort of one curb cut that then serves sort of a drive aisle that supports all the units either from the side or the rear.
Okay, and then I'm also thinking about some other new construction I've seen in the city where the front yard is very small, taken up by a driveway that is parallel and takes up almost the whole front yard. So that wouldn't be like Miller House, for example, has a driveway that pulls in front. So that would not be permitted either.
Yeah, something that didn't make the chart but was in the Planning Commission's recommendations was to allow one curb cut per street frontage. So if you had a corner lot, you could have one driveway on each side. But if you had an interior lot, not a corner lot, you could have one curb cut to access the site.
So, but are we assuming underground parking then? Or interior?
No, so it would be surface parking. Actually, if we go back to those, if you want to entertain it, the townhouse examples that we have in the staff report, they actually show how sort of, so here there's sort of one drive, this one actually has two curb cuts along Park Avenue, but then there's a driveway that sort of snakes sort of behind and around the site. And the same with the next example as well. There's a drive aisle on either side. And then that supports the car access to each of the units from the side versus from the street.
Got it. Thanks.
Ms. Hiscott?
But if there was another Miller House type of use, because, that's a great community use and fully utilized, they could go through the SUP process and ask for an exception to that parking requirement, I'm imagining, because there could be another Miller House type of thing that there's a reason why that parking is there for handicapped access, et cetera. So in my mind, I'm thinking that could be another possibility. You wouldn't be blocking it out entirely, right? Through a SUP process?
Yeah, well, each development would have the ability to have a curb cut and have a driveway and an access. They wouldn't be able to necessarily park in the front yard, but I suppose they do use a space up there for loading. But I think you could provide a waiver, maybe to the Planning Commission at site plan or something like that, where given the specifics of the site or some special consideration for the use, they could grant a waiver on the parking restriction there.
Mr. Snyder?
On the parking, I'm particularly interested in what is a realistic assessment of the parking needs for the types of buildings that we think we're going to get. If it's more than one per home, then I think we have to be honest with neighborhoods that we're throwing more parking into their neighborhoods.
Okay, I've got a couple questions or comments. Could somebody, I know we've heard this and I've seen this, but just bear with me. on historic properties, which I know there may be 4, maybe more, I don't know what it is. How does that work? You've got an old house on a fairly large lot. It's more valuable to put up, 9 townhouses than keep a 1860s whatever house. How does all this work?
So at the site plan level, once that's submitted, the property before being able to proceed would have to go on the market, right, at fair market value, whatever that's determined to be for a year's time. And then if that's not sold, I think, by someone who wants to otherwise preserve that property, then the applicant under the HCC would be able to proceed with their redevelopment plan.
So let me ask the city attorney to put him on the spot again, and if you're not comfortable right this minute, just say so. I've got a beautiful Victorian house from 1870 on 3/4 of an acre, and it's a little run down. It's worth $900,000 if you occupy it as a single-family house. It's worth $2 million if you tear it down and put up 7 townhouses. How does that work with, putting that on the market and the like?
I appreciate you giving me the out of allowing me to look at that one a little separately. It's a very specific example, so we'll get back to you on that one.
Okay, that's fine. It's totally fine, totally understandable. I think I'd say the same thing. But I'm just concerned that, we may lose, without further protections, lose some of these old properties because they're worth a whole lot more. You're better off dead than, you're worth more dead than alive, maybe. And so I just want to make sure we have mechanisms in place. What's that? Yeah, but particularly the historic ones. There's some really beautiful houses. Anyway, I guess I would just ask maybe to take a look at that if you could, and if there are anything we need to follow up with staff-wise to make sure we do all we can to preserve, because we may increase the value of the lot significantly by allowing more density than would be allowed otherwise. So something to think about. With respect to parking, I would just say I think we need to be a little careful about that. The single-family houses, probably every new single-family house doesn't have 1 parking space. It has at least 2 parking spaces because that's just what the market is now. And the single-family houses that were built 40 years ago probably have driveways that can support 2 cars anyway because they have a lot farther setback and the like. So anyway, I think it's a little hard to compare these things. What I would say is that I know some people feel the streets are for everyone's parking, and you don't have to park enough here, put it on the street. I do think the street parking serves a lot of purposes. For example, next to the library, our library is underparked, and regularly people park along the street to go to the library. And regularly those spots are taken up with Madison Homes car people. I know some of them who park their cars in the street. That's where they go every day. And so I guess I would just say that if we do something like this, we may need to consider having zone parking so that what we consider parking that would be for businesses, for civic, events such as going to the library, going to the State Theater, going to other places in the city that are already underparked, are not somehow kind of jammed out of getting on-street parking. And lastly, I would note that bike lanes also, I think, in some ways are in conflict with parking. And if we put more and more parking on the streets, it's less and less likely we're going to find a solution that allows bike lanes when everybody needs the streets for their parking. That's where my car goes. So I think we need to be very careful about that and just ask that we give some further consideration to our parking situation. Why don't we go on to the next box, which is affordable housing. So I think we've heard from the city attorney about this. I don't know if there's more to be said by folks. Mr. Snyder?
I would just say that I think our initial recommendation of 10% of all new homes must meet affordable or workforce housing AMI requirements is a good minimum, and maybe it should be more. And I would note that the issue of affordable housing could have been addressed in all the mixed-use projects that have gone up over the last 20 years, and it really wasn't very effectively negotiated by the city because the developers didn't want to build it. So I think we should be tough on this one. Developers are gonna make a profit from this, and they can put some of that profit into affordable houses.
Other comments about this particular section? Ms. Leon?
I I support Mr. Snyder on this one. I think that it's bad to have no affordable housing requirement in T-zones. So I think at least 10% would be wonderful. I'd be open to more, but I think 10 works.
Ms. Hardy?
As the liaison on the Housing Commission, the nuance in the recommendation was 10% or cash in lieu. So given that it's either going to be a small number of units, it may not make sense to only get one unit out of there, but the cash could be useful to be used in other affordable projects. And so I think if the recommendation does not include that, I think it's worth considering.
Yeah.
Also agree.
Okay, why don't we move on to oh, sorry, Phil. Phil?
I agree with that. Cash in lieu, good.
Okay, let's move on to project review.
And I'll just add one other thing to sort of bookmark. As we're considering cash in lieu on smaller projects, it'd be good to have sort of a proportional cash in lieu as well. Because if you're at 10%, but you have 10% of a very small number of units might mean that you want to apply that 10% and get cash for 3/4 of a unit or something like that to meet that 10% metric. So proportionality for cash in lieu is something that we'll try to carry forward into future discussions as well.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to project reviews. People have comments about this last block here?
Just
Ms. Conley?
when we say site plan includes a grading plan, right?
Yes, I believe so.
Yes. So although the 1 to 4 family buildings is the one the Planning Commission proposes with a grading plan, the SUP and site plan below also includes a grading plan as part of the site plan.
Right. Under the recommendation 3 and 4 family homes would include the larger site plan review process.
Okay, so the townhouse, multifamily, commercial. Okay, thank you.
I've got a question again for the city attorney who probably is getting sick of me real quick. Could you speak to the review standard for a site plan? Is that essentially like a ministerial act, or does that have the same discretion and approval as a legislative action?
The short answer is it's almost exclusively ministerial, but Mr. Stoddard may have additional input on that.
No, that's not as an attorney, but as a planner, that's my read on it, that there are standards laid out and the Planning Commission has to evaluate it against those standards. And of course, there are judgments to be made by each commissioner. That's why the commission votes, not staff. But the commissioners apply those standards. They each make their own judgments about whether those are met or not, and then they vote.
So the reason I bring that up is just for people, it's kind of a leading question, but a site plan doesn't have the same level of discretion as something we do. So I would just make sure that people understand when it goes to site plan, it's not like people really have a lot of discretion or flexibility to say, I really don't like this. Well, if it meets the standards, you really need to approve it, and sort of vice versa. So just wanted to put that marker out there and confirm from our city attorney that as well. Why don't we go to just general comments? Hopefully there's not a whole ton of them. We could take a break. Okay, go ahead.
So while we're on standards, we started talking about line 721, Paul, about standards for the SUP criteria, like how do we evaluate whether something is worthy of getting an SUP approval. I guess I have a red line that my colleagues can consider. So instead of just saying project promotes creation of affordable housing that meets current and future needs, I would like it to say affordable and or diverse housing that meets current and future needs, given that we've talked about how housing types are important. And so if there's support for that, that would be my suggestion. If we're allowed to do it, also if the city attorney concurs.
I turned my camera off too quickly. That language is probably appropriate. We'll look at that as well.
Great. And then more of a suggestion, Paul, when we get to kind of the next town hall, I think it was in a previous either Planning Commission work session or one of the other meetings that I attended, you talked about kind of the hurdle of the SE process today. and how expensive it is for projects to come through the SC process. I think that would be very helpful information to people understand why the SUP process is being proposed, especially for these small-scale projects. If our intent is ultimately to create housing types that we want and to see the development and reinvestment in T-zones, holding too high of a bar just hasn't economically made sense for a lot of the builders. So I think that context you'd shared was really good.
Yeah, I can certainly speak to that. The application process for an SE between the soft costs and then carrying costs and the time to final consideration can be several $100,000 to $1 million. And when you're thinking about a project with 300 units, you can spread that cost across 300 units and cover it. But when you're thinking about these townhouse projects are probably going to be somewhere in that 20 unit per acre maximum. So when you're thinking about those kinds of application costs on a scale of just a 20 unit project, it just becomes infeasible very quickly.
All right. Are there any final comments before we wrap up this conversation and take a short break, Ms. Connolly?
I just have one wrap up, and that I want to thank everyone who's here, who's still here, who's been here from the day that we started this 2 years ago. It was new to all of us. It was new to all of you. There's a lot of unknowns here. I'm glad that Mr. Stoddard, when he first started talking about this, referenced our vision, a deep commitment to progress. And I know that means a lot of different things to different people, but a deep commitment means deep study, lots of comment, lots of listening. Did we think it was going to take 2 years to get here? Nope. And I hope it doesn't take another 2 years to come up with something that works. Mr. Snyder at the beginning characterized this process as broken, but I disagree because, and if you do feel that you weren't heard, I'm sorry, because you were heard. And we just weren't prepared to respond yet. And we're gathering information. That's the best that the Planning Commission and the City Council can do, is keep gathering information so that we get those answers. So we had staff changes as we went along. Mr. Trainer's been here less than a year, and he's an expert on this, so thank you very much. We had an election, so in those 2 years, so we had someone else who had to learn about how this all works. We read your petitions. We heard comment, we had public listening sessions, office hours. All of those things are ways that City Council gathers information. So if you thought any of us weren't listening, please know that that's not true. We're really listening, and we really want to do this right. The Planning Commission, I think, did a great job. They made a lot of good changes, and I feel like we congratulated them on a lot of those tonight, but I think that's really important. And you heard us tonight. We're really grappling with getting this right. We know that consensus works better and collaboration works better, and we're really trying to make sure that we come up with something that is a balance between things we know and like and that deep commitment to progress. And it has to be carefully calibrated. So we're really working hard at this and hope that you'll continue to be involved. And thank you for that commitment, and thank you for your comments as we go forward.
All right, thank you. Mr. Snyder, is something you wanted to say?
Yeah, just to agree that it's all about trying to deal with very, very complicated, multifaceted, and interconnected issues. There's no question about it. I guess, and a lot of the work that the Planning Commission did was quite good. However, I will say that responding and citing developer comments that were not available to the public until a couple hours before the meeting is a broken process.
Ms. Hardy?
I appreciate Mary Beth's comment because I actually was thinking something similar, especially with the chair of the Planning Commission and the audience. Thank you for joining us today. I thought, again, the Planning Commission's recommendations were thorough and thoughtful. Having been to the listening session, multiple work sessions with them, the 5 work sessions we've had, I think that process actually is working well. And as evidenced by the chart that we just went through and spent 2 hours on, it is showing the evolution of the process and showing improvement over time, which is exactly what the process is meant to do. But to one of the earlier comments that I think it's creating unnecessary kind of divisiveness and conflict in the community, I do think that when we get ready for the town hall, again, restating the original goals is really important because I do think there's a fair amount of misinformation that's been perpetuated through the community about what the original intent was and why we're pursuing this. So starting often with goals, I find, is a good way to really unite people, right? Because it's a good way to make sure that people understand that we all actually have the same shared goals of creating kind of more diverse community and housing types and see more vibrancy in these T-zones. I think I've suggested a number of kind of other comments throughout, but we can spend more time getting ready for that town hall. But I do think restating the original goals, confirming kind of the progress that we've made through the Planning Commission process to show people how this has evolved, I think will be important so that people know that their comments, to Mary Beth's point, are being incorporated along the way, and I think the process is working as it should. So I appreciate staff as well as the Planning Commission getting us to this point. Thank you.
One more comment.
Ms. Leon?
I do think I support and appreciate the staff's efforts to do this town hall. I think to address Mr. Snyder's comments that when you publish this version of the town hall, that you make sure that you provide accessibility for all of the cited developer feedback that was, included in the Planning Commission, and just make it transparent. At that point, it would have been, what, 3 weeks or, since the last planning session, so just continue to make sure that you have all the information that you have and just publish it in advance of the town hall, in advance, so that folks have it. I think that'll be really helpful and responsive to what Mr. Snyder is saying when it comes to developer feedback. Because we do want to hear developer feedback. Let's not criticize, to the point where we lose that feedback is needed around understanding how this land is going to be used. All right. Thank you.
All right. Again, we've heard it from everyone here. Thank you. The Planning Commission did a great job wrestling with some very difficult issues, but the community as well. We know this is very important to you, where you live, what you look out your window every day to. We understand is really deep to your heart and extremely important, and we get that. We just spent the past couple hours wrestling with this, and we understand how complicated these matters are. And, there are many issues that we don't have a consensus on just yet, I think, that we're still grappling with. So this is a process that continues. The next step is a town hall, possibly a second town hall, and then further opportunities for you to comment as well as members of the community. You're also always welcome to speak to us individually, either by electronic means, by telephone, or just to sit down with us. Almost all of us will spend time with each and every one of you individually, should you so desire. So thank you all for coming out. We're going to take a short recess, maybe a 7-minute recess or so, and get back at it. But thanks so much for coming out this evening. Pick up some speed. Sewer fee waiver. Mr. Shields.
Okay, thank you, and I'll be very brief on this. This is a property at 111 Tenor Hill Road that is currently served by a private well and a septic system. And the city, the house is also straddling the line between Fairfax County and the city of Falls Church, with the majority of the property in Fairfax County and the majority, almost the entirety of the residents in Fairfax County. We're working to get this home onto public services for water and sewer. In our discussions with the county about how to facilitate that, staff has discussed waiving the sewer tap fees, which would, per city code, would be $7,600 for a single-family hookup. And so this resolution would, $7,680 would grant a waiver for that one-time charge, given the unique situation in this case. And I don't believe it would set a precedent because it's a very rare situation, and the resolution spells out some of the unique conditions that would apply to this home only. That's all I have, and happy to answer any questions.
Anyone have any issue with this? All right.
I don't have an issue with it, but my question is, what's Fairfax County doing? Are they contributing?
So Fairfax County, the water tap fees are also trying to be worked through so that those can be affordable to the homeowners. And they're also trying to get the homeowners in touch with other home improvement dollars that would be available through other sources. So that's kind of the basket of efforts on the county side.
Phil?
It's a good thing. I'm for it. My question is its impact on the assessment of the property, even through the mass appraisal method. I would think that a house which does not have reliable water service would be worth substantially less than one that now will have reliable water service, and just want to make sure the folks who live there are going to be prepared to absorb a higher assessment and the higher taxes that that's likely to bring.
It's a good point.
Letty?
So I support this. My question is there anyone else in this city with well and septic service that we should consider extending this to?
I don't know exactly. I've heard that there are, but I just don't know exactly where they are. So I've put that question out to staff, and we're researching it. I think it's less than 5.
Yeah. I guess if we want to be equitable, would we want to do this for all of them?
The other unique considerations are there are federal guidelines for low to moderate income houses, which makes this home eligible for other benefits in Fairfax County. So that is the other unique consideration that's referenced in the resolution.
I guess I would say that if we overlay that on top of the sewer and well consideration, if there's other properties that qualify for both, then I guess I'd want the same policy applied.
Okay.
All right. Unless there's anything else, let's move on to the next item, the last item. Did you have something? Okay, let's go on to the last item, Mr. Shields.
Okay, so this is just a work session discussion on the commercial and industrial tax for transportation. And this was discussed last year at budget time, and council on its work plan asked to have just an open discussion about this and a briefing of some of the policy issues and the things that council might consider in the future if you wanted to consider this tax. Essentially what it is the ability to assess a real estate tax up to 12.5 cents on properties that are zoned or used for commercial or industrial uses. Multifamily, apartments, condos are not subject to this tax. Only office buildings, retail, and commercial and industrial uses. The proceeds of the tax, if it were assessed, would generate about $90,000 per penny. And that $90,000 per penny could be used only for eligible transportation projects. To be eligible, it has to be for an expansion of the transportation system to relieve congestion, some new roads, new transit infrastructure, new sidewalks, new bicycle facilities that improve the efficiency and access to transportation. Last thing I will say about this is that we currently fund our transportation projects, which are very significant. We have $93 million in the CIP for transportation projects that we'll be talking about later this spring, and the Planning Commission has already acted on to recommend to the City Council. We have a big transportation program in the city. We use what we call a C&I equivalent revenues, which is essentially just regular city tax dollars. That we call it C&I equivalent because it qualifies then for our matches with the NVTA. So it's regular tax dollars that we then brand as C&I equivalent dollars. Those two can only be used for transportation, but the rules are a bit more broad in terms of what types of projects are eligible. And so typically C&I-E or C&I equivalent are better tuned for Falls Church types of projects, smaller scale, not really widening roads and things like that, but other transportations that are typical for the city. So that's the sort of the overview on this, and happy to answer any council questions and any council direction on further interest in exploring this option.
Ms. Conley,
Thanks.
do you have a comment?
You read my mind.
Okay,
I didn't
yeah.
even get my hand all the way up. My question is this: the fact that we do not have a C&I tax, when we get to comparisons of business taxes, we should include that in the analysis that's part of the budget. So when people talk about the BPAL tax in Falls Church is a different rate than nearby jurisdictions, or other business taxes are different rates, we do need to include this fact as something that they're not paying if they are in the city of Falls Church. And I think that has been included in the past. I just want to put a note and make sure that it's in there this year.
It has been, but it's duly noted. Thank you.
Ms. Sardi?
I wanted to go back to one of the things you introduced, Wyatt, which was the state does not allow us to assess C&I on multifamily. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So what about the ground floor of a building like that?
So for a mixed-use building, Ms. Mester, do you know the answer to that question?
Yes, the commercial part on first floor is assessed, just not the multifamily residential.
So we can.
Well, I think it has to be a condo structure, so if one owner owns the whole mixed use, then it can't be, but if it is condoed and a separate legal structure for the commercial, it can be.
And how many of those do we have? Do we know?
So Pearson Square is condoed. To tell the truth, usually the mixed use do a vertical condomization of the retail piece. So most of our more recent ones, they could be taxed on the ground floor.
Got it. And so the reason I ask this is because I want to understand the impact to businesses, right? So if you're a large owner of a multifamily building, you might be able to actually absorb a tax like this and not necessarily pass through it to the rents, because obviously that's can be a lot more dependent on market rents upstairs. But I guess it depends on that answer. So I guess I'd like to know whether ground floor can get the C&I tax. The related point is, if we did assess this, I think the majority of our leases in the city are triple net leases, which means that taxes do get passed on to the tenants versus the landlord having to absorb it. I guess I'd like to understand what the average impact to small businesses might be if we assessed some sort of CNI in the future as a result.
And I'll have to check to see how much visibility we have on those lease structures. I can try to find that out.
Yeah, I bet the commercial brokers who work in town could tell us what the majority of the deals done are. Thank you.
Mr. Snyder?
I agree with all of the comments made by council members. It seems to me that there's an absolute policy basis for doing this, but that's not the end of the issue. We have a business community that's structured differently from Fairfax County and Tyson's Corner, obviously, and we've been very sensitive to that. I'm interested if we can make a case to our smaller businesses that the value is worth the expenditure, and I think that's the ultimate sort of question. So have we had any discussion with the business community on this? I know it was kind of, if you will, put out there during the last budget, and it created a negative reaction. Has there been any discussion this year about it with the business community?
There has not been, other than sort of just quiet conversations. There hasn't been any kind of a session on it with any of our members of the business community.
Well, I think if we're going to move forward with any kind of a discussion of this, we need to bring them in and we need to figure out, okay, what of value, is there anything that we could provide within the expenditure scope of the CNI tax revenue that the business community as a community would view as being worth the additional tax?
All right, Ms. Leon.
I'm very concerned about the impact to businesses, particularly small businesses that, lease and pay rent in some of these buildings. I want to make sure that we're considering not only the benefits, as Mr. Snyder said, but from a rollout perspective, we're still providing ARPA funding to businesses as part of recovery from COVID. So I want to make sure that when we consider this, we are very cognizant of the change management that's involved, right, in rolling this out. So it is very important to give this topic enough engagement time, right, with our business community for them to understand what it is so that we can extract, what this is, and if it is 5 cents within the tolerable threshold, it might, I think we need to litmus test the 5 cents on the 100, right, the quote out there, because it's low compared to Fairfax, Arlington, and Fairfax City, which I wonder why Alexandria is 0.
Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah.
Yeah, Alexandria has not adopted that, or doesn't have it in effect right now. And I think Loudoun and Prince William do not have it as well.
Yeah, but they are drawing their 12.5 cents of NVTA, which means they're doing the CNIE and putting it into the special transportation fund.
Phil?
So they're more like we are right now.
I think I agree with Mr. Snyder and Ms. Leon particularly. And my 2 cents is, given all the many things that the manager has to spend his time on, my answer to the question whether this should be considered as part of the FY24 budget is no. We should be considering trying to sharpen our pencils and go in the other direction and try to provide some tax rate relief wherever we can.
All right, thank you. Any other comments? I suspect that's the mood of this council is to, we appreciate you considering the requests made of you, but that this is something probably I think most of us would not like to proceed with this year.
Okay, thank you. It's useful guidance. Thank you.
Sure. All right, is there anything else anybody wants to talk about before we adjourn for this evening? Ms. Hiscott?
Just two quick things. I had received a text during the solid waste management discussion from a business owner who said they were required to maintain recycling and trash at significant expense. So they felt there already was a mandate and a requirement as a business owner to recycle in Falls Church City. That was a question we hadn't answered at the time. So I just want to share that. And then I also had a question from a couple of people that I didn't know the answer to about more 2-hour parking signs installed on South Maple, and what was the origin of why. I don't know if that's a quick
Yeah, we got that
answer.
email as well, so I'm looking into that, and I'll get back with the constituent on that question.
Thank you. That's it.
Phil?
I just want to thank all my colleagues and staff for helping facilitate my participation in the meeting tonight. It took a village, and I really appreciate it.
Well, we wish you the best of luck, Phil. If there's anything we could do to help you, certainly let us know. Any other comments before we adjourn? All right, let's do it. Let's head out of here. We're adjourned.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody.